the story of the Apache begins far to the north, in a land very different from the deserts and mountains of the American Southwest that would one day become inseparable from their name. Linguistic and archaeological evidence places the deep ancestors of the Apache among the Athabascan-speaking peoples of northwestern Canada and Alaska. These were groups that had adapted to some of the harshest climates in North America, surviving in cold forests and tundra, hunters of caribou, moose, and small game, gatherers of berries and roots, moving in seasonal cycles shaped by the land and the animals upon which they depended. The Apache belonged to the southern branch of this great Athabascan family, sharing distant kinship with the Navajo who made the same southward journey, and with peoples who remained in the north such as the Dean. Linguistic reconstructions show remarkable consistency across thousands of miles, with words for fundamental activities like hunting, cooking, or travelling still retaining echoes of a common origin. These linguistic links are the threads connecting the scattered branches of a once more unified culture that stretched across the continent. Archaeologists working in the American Southwest have traced the presence of Athabascan speakers through distinctive patterns in stone tools, ceramics, and settlement styles that appear relatively late in the region compared to older Puebloan and Mogollon traditions. The prevailing consensus is that sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries, groups of Athabascan migrants began to filter into the southern plains and deserts, gradually adapting their lifeways to a radically different ecological setting. Instead of cold forests and northern rivers, they entered a world of arid mesas, expansive grasslands, and mountain ranges that rose like islands from the desert seas. Their transition was not instantaneous. They carried with them traditions suited to northern environments, yet necessity demanded innovation. Small kin-based bands roamed widely, learning which plants could be eaten, which animals thrived in each ecological niche, and how to navigate territories already occupied by long-established peoples. The migration south was not a single mass movement, but a long process spanning generations. Some groups pushed through the plains, skirting the territories of powerful peoples like the Comanche, who would later dominate much of that region. Others moved along river corridors, following seasonal game migrations. Oral traditions preserved by Apache descendants remember this long journey, not in terms of archaeological dates, but through stories of ancestors travelling, seeking, encountering new lands, and gradually becoming the people that later history would recognise as Apache. These traditions speak of difficult passages, conflicts with neighbouring groups, and the forging of new alliances that gave shape to Apache identity. The process of becoming Apache was as much about cultural synthesis and adaptation as it was about physical relocation. Their northern roots gave them linguistic unity, but their southern experiences created the distinct societies historians later grouped together under a single name. When Spanish explorers first encountered the Apache in the 16th century, they noted groups living in widely scattered regions, from the plains of Texas to the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico. This dispersion reflected the long centuries of migration and adaptation that had preceded contact. Each subgroup developed particular adaptations to the environments they occupied. The Lipan ranged widely across the Texas plains, skilled in bison hunting and raiding. The Mescalero established themselves in the mountainous regions where agave or mezcal provided a reliable food source, roasted in earth ovens in great communal gatherings that became central to their seasonal rhythm. The Chiricahua occupied rugged mountain strongholds along the Arizona-New Mexico borderlands, positions that would later give them strategic advantage in resisting external pressure. The western Apache spread across the Arizona highlands, while the Jicarilla lived near the northern Rio Grande and into southern Colorado. Together, these subgroups illustrate the flexibility of a people who had entered a new land and transformed their culture to meet its challenges. The linguistic record confirms that these groups retained their Athabascan heritage, while developing regional dialects and identities. Scholars analysing oral traditions and kinship systems see evidence of a shared core worldview that bound the Apache together, even as they diverged geographically. their social organizations centered on extended family groups, often referred to as bands, that moved independently yet maintained ties of kinship and shared ceremonial life. This flexible structure made it possible to survive in scattered environments, uniting when necessary for defense or large communal hunts, but otherwise retaining mobility that was essential in environments where resources were thinly distributed. The journey from the northern forests to the southern deserts also meant an encounter with long-established civilizations of the southwest. Pueblo peoples had built complex societies around irrigated agriculture, permanent towns, and intricate ceremonial systems. The Mogollon and Hohokam traditions had already shaped the region for centuries before Athabascan speakers arrived. Interaction between the newcomers and the established societies was inevitable. Sometimes it was peaceful, involving trade in foodstuffs, tools, and ceremonial knowledge. Other times it was marked by conflict, as mobile bands raided agricultural settlements for grain and livestock. Over time, these relationships produced a cultural dynamic that defined much of Apache life in the centuries to come, a balance between independence and interaction, between reliance on mobility and dependence on the products of neighboring communities. Archaeological evidence shows that the early Apache did not immediately abandon older northern traditions. Sites associated with Proto-Apache groups often contain a mixture of northern tool styles with new adaptations suited to the southwest. Gradually, as generations passed, material culture shifted more fully toward the distinctive patterns recognized as Apache. This included the use of brush shelters or wickiups, easily constructed and dismantled as groups moved with the seasons. It included the roasting pits for agave hearts, a practice so central it gave the mescalero their very name. It also included the development of basketry, hide processing, and weaponry that reflected both inherited skills and new necessities. The bow and arrow remained central to hunting and warfare, but new techniques for horse use would later revolutionize mobility and combat. The historical record only begins to capture glimpses of the Apache in the early contact period. Spanish explorers moving north from Mexico in the 1500s described hostile encounters with groups they labeled generically as Apaches, a name derived from the Zuni word meaning enemy. The application of this label across diverse bands reflected outsider perception more than internal self-identity. For the people themselves, identity was defined locally by family, band, and the landscapes they called home. Yet the name stuck, and in colonial documents the Apache appear as both feared raiders and elusive trading partners. These early contacts reveal how far the Athabascan migrants had travelled from their northern homelands, and how deeply they had already embedded themselves into the geopolitical landscape of the Southwest. The migration southward also reshaped spiritual understandings. The Apache carried with them a worldview rooted in respect for the natural world, for animals, plants, and landscapes inhabited by spiritual powers. In their northern homelands, these powers were tied to forests, rivers, and tundra. In the new lands, they encountered deserts, mountains, and a different constellation of sacred sites. Over time, the story shifted, but the underlying framework remained. Humans existed in a world alive with spiritual presence, requiring careful observance of rituals to maintain harmony. This adaptability of belief systems allowed the Apache to remain spiritually connected even as their physical world changed. It also provided the foundation for the elaborate ceremonial traditions that would later develop, from girls' puberty rites to healing ceremonies conducted by medicine men and women. Tracing the Athabascan migrations requires piecing together fragments from many disciplines: linguistics, archaeology, ethnography, and oral history. Each provides part of the puzzle. Linguistic analysis shows how long it would have taken for dialects to diverge as they did. Archaeological sites provide material evidence of newcomers appearing in regions where they had not been before. Oral traditions provide the human perspective, stories of ancestors on the move, searching for a homeland. When these are combined, a picture emerges of a centuries-long southward drift, punctuated by moments of settlement conflict and adaptation, until finally the Apache became inseparable from the landscapes of the Southwest. This long process also explains why the Apache never formed a single centralized nation in the sense of some other native peoples. Their identity was forged through mobility, through adaptation to scattered environments, and through constant negotiation with powerful neighbors. This left them decentralized but also highly resilient. Bands could vanish into mountains, relocate across hundreds of miles, or reorganize under new leaders. Such flexibility would prove decisive when they later faced the pressures of Spanish, Mexican, and American expansion. The deep memory of migration had already taught them that survival meant moving, adapting, and never depending on a single place or institution for existence. By the time Europeans began to push into the northern Mexican frontier, the Apache had already been present in the region for centuries, fully integrated into its cycles of trade, warfare, and diplomacy. Their Athabascan origins were a distant memory, preserved in language and story, but no longer consciously connected to the northern forests from which they came. What mattered now was the life they had built in the mountains and deserts, the kinship systems that bound their families together, and the hard-won knowledge of how to thrive in lands others considered inhospitable. The migration had transformed them, but it had also given them the skills that would make them one of the most enduring peoples of the American frontier. The earlier centuries of Apache life in the Southwest were defined by the constant search for balance between the demands of the environment and the opportunities it offered. The lands they occupied were immense, stretching from the edge of the southern plains of Texas through the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona into the rugged mountain ranges that gave shelter and resources when open country became dangerous. These were not empty lands. Long before the Athabascan migrants arrived, Pueblo peoples had cultivated corn, beans, and squash along the Rio Grande, and in scattered villages built of stone and adobe. To the east, the plains teemed with herds of bison that could sustain entire populations if the skills to hunt them were mastered. To the south, Mexican settlements and missions represented yet another set of relationships, sometimes hostile and sometimes transactional. Early Apache communities had to navigate all of this while shaping their own identity as a people, distinct from their neighbors. Archaeological traces of early Apache settlements suggest small, highly mobile groups rather than large permanent towns. They built wickiups, dome-shaped brush shelters made from poles covered in grass or branches. These were quick to construct, easy to abandon, and perfectly suited for people who might need to move on short notice. Camps often left little behind, only fire pits, roasting ovens for agave, and scattered stone tools that archaeologists now struggle to interpret. But this minimal footprint was deliberate. Mobility was a survival strategy, allowing families to exploit seasonal resources, avoid enemies, and adjust to unpredictable weather. To an outsider it might appear rootless, yet to those living it, the land itself was the anchor, with each mountain, river, and canyon remembered, named, and woven into oral history. Food gathering was the daily rhythm that structured Apache life. Women dug for roots, harvested cactus fruits, and gathered wild seeds that could be ground into meal. Agave was roasted in large earth ovens, the slow baking process turning its fibrous core into sweet, nourishing food that could be stored or carried. Mesquite beans were ground into flour. Pinon nuts were gathered in autumn, while juniper berries and acorns added variety. Men hunted deer, rabbits, and other game, while bison hunts on the plains provided massive but risky rewards. These hunting expeditions required coordination, skill, and courage. Before horses became central, hunts were conducted on foot, with groups surrounding herds and driving animals into ambushes. The arrival of the horse later transformed these hunts, but in the early centuries they remained challenging undertakings, where success could mean months of security and failure could bring hardship. The plains presented both opportunities and dangers. Bison herds stretched across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, But these lands were contested by other powerful peoples. The Comanche in particular became formidable rivals, masters of horse warfare who swept across the plains by the 1700s. For the Apache, venturing too far east risked confrontation with these groups, yet the lure of bison meat, hides, and trade goods drew them again and again. Raids and counter-raids became a fact of life, shaping Apache reputation as warriors long before American expansion reached their homelands. To the Spanish, who entered the picture from the south, the Apache were already seen as fierce raiders who could appear suddenly, strike settlements, and vanish into the wilderness. But this image only captured one side of life. Equally important were the daily cycles of gathering, child-rearing, storytelling, and ritual that sustained families across seasons. Family was the foundation of Apache social organization. Bands were composed of extended kin groups who made decisions collectively, though leadership often rested with men of proven ability in war or hunting. Women wielded significant influence in domestic and economic life, managing resources and ensuring the survival of children. Marriage created ties between bands, reinforcing networks that stretched across wide territories. This loose structure allowed flexibility. A band facing scarcity or conflict could split off, join relatives in another region, or establish its own path. Such independence also made it difficult for outsiders to negotiate with Apache as a unified people, since no single leader could speak for all. This political fragmentation frustrated Spanish and later American authorities who sought treaties. But for the Apache it was essential, ensuring that no calamity could wipe out the entire people at once. Religion and ritual infused daily life with meaning. The Apache recognized a world alive with spiritual forces. Mountains, springs, and animals were imbued with power. Ceremonies sought to maintain harmony between humans and these forces, ensuring health, fertility, and success in hunting. Healing rituals were conducted by men and women who possessed spiritual knowledge, using herbs, songs, and sacred objects to restore balance when sickness struck. One of the most enduring traditions was the girls' puberty ceremony, marking the transition into womanhood with elaborate rituals that could last several days, involving dancing, songs, and blessings from elders. These ceremonies tied individuals to the wider community, affirming continuity between generations and between the human and spiritual realms. While outsiders often overlooked or dismissed such practices, for the Apache they were essential to survival, ensuring that physical needs were met within a framework of meaning. Contact with Pueblo peoples brought new complexities. The Pueblo had long histories of settled agriculture, building multi-storied towns of stone and adobe, irrigating fields and conducting elaborate ceremonies tied to the cycles of planting and harvest. To the mobile Apache, these towns represented both opportunity and temptation. Trade allowed the exchange of hides, meat, and wild foods for corn, cotton, and crafted goods. Raiding offered another means of obtaining what was needed, though it risked retaliation. The relationship was never static. Sometimes alliances were formed against common enemies such as the Spanish or the Comanche. At other times, enmity flared, with raids and counter-raids becoming part of the cycle of survival. Through it all, Apache bands learned to adapt, to negotiate between hostility and cooperation, never allowing themselves to become fully dependent on agricultural neighbours, but always keeping the option open when conditions required. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century intensified these dynamics. Spanish explorers brought horses, steel weapons, and livestock, all of which transformed the region. Initially, the Apache encountered these newcomers as distant raiders pushing northward from Mexico. Missions and presidios dotted the frontier, offering targets for raids but also new goods that could be integrated into Apache life. Horses in particular revolutionized mobility. At first obtained through raids or trade, they quickly became central to Apache warfare and hunting. Mounted warriors could cover vast distances, striking settlements or pursuing bison with unprecedented speed. Horses also increased the range of bands, allowing them to connect more easily across scattered territories. Yet the spread of Spanish power also meant greater danger. Disease, forced labour and military campaigns posed constant threats. For the Apache, the solution was the same as it had always been: adapt, resist, and move as needed. The early centuries of Apache presence in the southwest thus reveal a pattern of constant adaptation. From their northern origins, they had carried a tradition of mobility, kinship, and spiritual balance. In their new lands, they learned to exploit desert plants, hunt bison, raid settlements, and trade with agricultural peoples. Their social organisation remained flexible, allowing them to respond quickly to changing circumstances. Their reputation as warriors grew, not simply because of inherent aggressiveness, but because survival demanded defence of territory, competition for resources, and retaliation against enemies. To outsiders, they seemed elusive, difficult to subdue or control. To themselves, they were simply living as they had always done, in harmony with the land, resilient against threats, and committed to the survival of their families. It is important to understand that what outsiders labelled as raiding was, for the Apache, an extension of survival strategy. In arid lands where crops could fail and game might be scarce, raiding provided a means to obtain what was necessary. It was not random violence but calculated risk, often conducted with skill and discipline. Bands planned raids carefully, choosing targets where success was likely and retreat was possible. The spoils, livestock, food, weapons, captives, were distributed according to need, reinforcing bonds within the group. Such raids also served as tests of courage and skill for young warriors, integrating them into the responsibilities of adulthood. To the Spanish, Mexican, and later American settlers, this behaviour was terrifying. To the Apache, it was simply life, as integral as hunting or gathering. The environment itself shaped every choice. The deserts and plains could be unforgiving, with droughts, harsh winters, and sudden storms. Knowing where to find water, when to move herds, which plants could sustain life, was knowledge accumulated over generations. Oral tradition carried this wisdom, ensuring that even in times of scarcity, families could endure. This deep environmental knowledge also gave Apache an advantage over outsiders, who often found the land hostile and incomprehensible. Soldiers who pursued them frequently underestimated how easily Apache could vanish into canyons, survive on little food, and endure long marches. This mastery of terrain was not a matter of innate talent, but of centuries of accumulated experience, beginning in these early centuries when survival depended on intimate knowledge of every ridge and water source. Life on the plains and in the southwest was not static. Over the generations, patterns shifted, alliances changed, and new challenges emerged. But the foundation laid in this period remained constant: mobility, kinship, resilience, and the ability to adapt to whatever the land or neighbours presented. From the wiki-ups of early camps to the mountain strongholds of later resistance leaders, the Apache remained shaped by these early centuries, carrying forward traditions that had been forged in the crucible of survival. The lessons learned in these times would echo through every later struggle, whether against Spanish soldiers, Mexican militias, or American armies. It was here, in the plains and deserts of the Southwest, that the Apache became the people history remembers, a people both feared and admired, resilient and elusive, shaped by the land they called home. The Apache, though portrayed by outsiders as a single people, never operated as a single unified nation. Their strength came from the way they organised themselves into small, flexible and resilient groups that could survive independently, yet maintained bonds of kinship and culture across vast distances. To understand Apache life, one has to step inside this web of family, band and clan relations, to see how they built communities without centralised kings or chiefs in the European sense, yet maintained cohesion that lasted for centuries despite pressures from every direction. The most basic unit was the family, not simply the nuclear family of parents and children, but an extended family of siblings, cousins, grandparents, and in-laws who moved together as a camp. These family groups lived in wickiups clustered in small encampments, the brush dwellings easy to raise and abandon as the seasons demanded. At this level, survival was about cooperation in the most immediate sense. Women gathered, cooked, and processed hides, men hunted and defended, elders passed on knowledge, and children learned by doing. Kinship defined responsibility. A man owed loyalty not only to his wife and children but to her relatives, to his brothers-in-law, to nieces and nephews, all of whom created networks of obligation that extended far beyond a single household. From these families came bands, larger groups composed of multiple related families who chose to live and move together. The bands were not fixed in membership but fluid, expanding or contracting depending on circumstances. A band might number a few dozen people in lean times, or a few hundred when several families joined for hunting, defence, or ceremony. Decisions within the band were not handed down by absolute rulers, but made through consensus, guided by men of experience, wisdom, and courage. Leadership was situational. A man skilled in war might lead during a raid, but another with knowledge of plants or ritual might carry authority in matters of healing or ceremony. Women too wielded authority, especially elder women who advised on family alliances and the management of resources. Beyond the band level existed the clan, a crucial framework of Apache social identity. Clans were descent groups traced through the maternal line, meaning children belonged to their mother's clan, not their father's. This matrilineal system ensured that property, responsibility, and social identity passed through women, creating stability across generations. A man might move to live with his wife's people after marriage, strengthening ties between clans and spreading obligations across the community. This also meant that uncles on the mother's side carried particular authority in the lives of children, shaping their upbringing, guiding them in hunting, war, and ritual knowledge. The clan provided continuity, ensuring that even as bands shifted and dispersed, people remained tied to a larger identity stretching across distances. Different Apache groups recognized distinct sets of clans, with variations among the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and Western Apache. Some clans were associated with particular landscapes, animals, or mythic ancestors, anchoring identity in both kinship and the natural world. These associations reinforced the Apache sense of belonging, not only to family but to the land itself. In a world where movement was constant, clan identity gave a person a permanent place within the fabric of society, a lineage that stretched back into remembered past and mythic time. Leadership within Apache society puzzled outsiders. Spanish officials expected to deal with centralized chiefs who could sign treaties or command obedience, but the Apache did not operate in that manner. Leadership was earned, not inherited, and it was situational rather than absolute. A respected man gained influence through generosity, bravery, and wisdom. He might attract followers who trusted his judgment, but he could not compel obedience. If his decisions proved poor, people simply drifted away to join another leader or to form their own camp. This system prevented tyranny, but also made collective negotiations difficult. To the Apache, it was natural that each band had its own leaders, and that those leaders' authority extended only as far as people chose to recognize it. To colonial officials, this appeared as disorganization, but in truth it was a form of resilience. Generosity was one of the key traits expected of leaders. A man who hoarded wealth, horses, or food lost respect. A man who redistributed his gains, fed widows and orphans, and supported struggling families gained followers. This value ensured social cohesion, reducing inequality, and reinforcing the sense that survival depended on collective well-being. Warfare, too, was bound up in these values. A raid might be led by a man known for courage and skill, but success was measured not only by what was taken but by how it was shared. Prestige came from bringing home resources for the community, not personal enrichment alone. marriage arrangements further tied clans and bands together. Because of the matrilineal system, men sought wives outside their own clan, creating bonds across communities. Marriages were not simple transactions but negotiations involving families, sometimes sealed by exchanges of goods or livestock. Divorce was possible, and in such cases children remained with the mother's clan, ensuring stability. Polygyny sometimes occurred, especially when a man could support multiple wives, but it was not the dominant practice. What mattered most was the weaving of ties across bands and clans, ensuring networks of mutual support in times of scarcity or conflict. The upbringing of children reflected these structures. Boys were trained in hunting, tracking and warfare by their uncles, while girls were guided in gathering, cooking and ceremony by their mothers and grandmothers. Education was practical, embedded in daily life, but it was also moral, teaching respect for elders, generosity toward kin, and attentiveness to the spiritual world. Stories told around the fire reinforced these lessons, embedding memory of ancestors and mythic beings who had shaped the world. The Apache oral tradition thus functioned as both entertainment and education, ensuring that social values passed intact from generation to generation. Ceremonial life was another domain in which social structure revealed itself. The puberty ceremony for girls, one of the most important rituals, involved the entire community, reinforcing the bonds of clan and band. For several days, the girl, representing the figure of changing woman, underwent blessings, dances and teachings that bound her to the spiritual and social world of the Apache. Elders guided the ritual, families provided resources, and the event became a communal reaffirmation of identity. In this way, ceremony transcended the individual, binding the community together and linking the living with ancestors and spiritual powers. War parties, too, reflected the flexible nature of social structure. A respected warrior could call for volunteers, attracting men from multiple bands and clans. Each participant had the right to accept or refuse, and each carried his own responsibilities to family and clan. The leader provided guidance, but authority was based on respect, not compulsion. Success increased his prestige. Failure diminished it. Once the raid concluded, the party disbanded, and men returned to their families. There was no permanent standing force, only the willingness of individuals to join when circumstances demanded. This system reflected the broader pattern of Apache society: decentralized, flexible, and resistant to outside domination. Relations between bands could be cooperative or competitive depending on circumstances. In times of abundance, gatherings allowed for exchange of goods, marriages, and ceremonies. In times of scarcity, disputes over hunting grounds or raiding territories could arise. Yet even then, the web of kinship prevented outright fragmentation. People always had relatives in other bands, always had ties that could be reactivated in times of need. This balance of independence and interconnection was the hallmark of Apache society. Outsiders often mistook this system for weakness, assuming that lack of central authority made the Apache easy to conquer. In reality, it made them nearly impossible to subdue. No single victory could bring them to heel. Defeating one leader or band did not end resistance. Others simply carried on. Attempts to impose treaties or settlements with individual chiefs often failed because no one man spoke for all. This confounded Spanish, Mexican, and later American officials, who found themselves facing a foe that could not be decapitated or absorbed through traditional means. The very social structure that outsiders dismissed as disorganized was the source of Apache endurance. Even the way Apache groups defined themselves reflected this flexibility. The Spanish and later Americans grouped them under the single label Apache, but within the communities themselves, people identified first with their band and clan. Names like Chiricahua, Mescalero, Lipan, and Jicarilla reflected broader regional distinctions, but at the daily level it was family, clan, and band that mattered most. These identities shifted as circumstances demanded, but they always preserved the core values of kinship, generosity, and mobility. By the time colonial powers began pressing more heavily into their lands, the Apache had long since perfected this way of life. They knew how to balance independence with cooperation, how to adapt leadership to circumstance, how to maintain cohesion without rigid hierarchy. This made them extraordinarily resilient. They could scatter into small family groups to survive in harsh seasons, then come together for raids or ceremonies when opportunity arose. They could negotiate alliances or retaliate with violence, always with the backing of kinship networks that stretched across regions. Their social structure was not designed for empire or centralized rule, but for survival, and in that purpose it excelled. It is here, in the clans and bands that form the heart of Apache society, that one sees the key to their endurance. Outsiders may have focused on the raids, the battles, and the wars, but beneath those events lay a system of relationships that bound people together in daily life. The Apache did not need capitals, palaces, or kings to endure. They needed families that cared for one another, leaders who gave generously, and rituals that reaffirmed their place in the world. These provided the strength to face not only the challenges of the land, but the centuries of conflict that lay ahead. The Apache world was never divided between sacred and ordinary, between ritual and survival. For them, every action, every landscape, and every relationship carried meaning bound up in spiritual power. Their traditions developed out of centuries of movement across lands that were harsh but alive with forces beyond human control, and those forces demanded recognition, respect, and balance. To understand how the Apache saw the world is to step into a universe where mountains were alive, where spirits moved through animals and plants, and where ceremonies did not simply honour unseen beings, but kept the very order of life intact. One of the central figures in Apache cosmology was the being often called Changing Woman, a deity representing growth, renewal, and the cycles of life. She embodied the transitions that marked human existence, from birth through maturity to death, and she was the source of ceremonies that ensured continuity across generations. Her presence was felt especially in the puberty rites for girls, ceremonies that reenacted her power and blessed young women with strength, endurance, and fertility. In these moments, the community gathered not simply to honour an individual, but to renew its bond with the sacred. By invoking Changing Woman, they placed human life in harmony with the cosmic order. Sacred mountains stood as pillars of the Apache world. For the Western Apache, 4 mountains marked the cardinal directions, each imbued with spiritual significance, and each serving as a boundary that defined their universe. These mountains were not mere landmarks, but living entities, protectors, and sources of power. Ritual journeys, prayers, and offerings tied people to these sacred places, ensuring that their lives remained in balance with the natural world. The mountains also anchored stories of creation, journeys of ancestors, and the presence of spiritual beings who shaped the land. To live within their shadow was to exist within a sacred geography, where every ridge and canyon carried memory and meaning. The natural world was alive with spirits, sometimes helpful and sometimes dangerous. Animals were not just prey or resources, but messengers and teachers. The bear carried power associated with healing and strength, the eagle with vision and connection to the sky, the coyote with cunning and trickery. Stories told by elders preserved these associations, warning children against arrogance, encouraging respect for nature, and explaining why rituals had to be performed before hunts, after successful kills, or when encountering unusual signs. Plants too carried power. Medicinal herbs were gathered with ritual observance, songs sung to honour their spirit, and offerings left to maintain balance. In this way, every aspect of daily survival was infused with ceremony. Healing was a central domain of spiritual practice. Illness was not seen simply as a physical condition, but as a disturbance in the balance between human beings and spiritual forces. Healers, men, and women known for their knowledge of ritual, herbs, and songs, worked to restore that balance. They used chants, dances, and sacred objects, sometimes lasting for days to draw upon spiritual power. Healing ceremonies might involve sand paintings, created with coloured powders to depict sacred symbols and beings, serving as temporary gateways between the human and spiritual worlds. The patient sat within these images, receiving the power they carried, while the healer invoked songs passed down through generations. When the ritual concluded, the sand painting was destroyed, releasing the power and ensuring it was not misused. The girl's puberty ceremony, sometimes called the sunrise dance, was one of the most elaborate and important traditions. For several days, the young woman was transformed into changing woman, embodying her strength and fertility. The community gathered, building a ceremonial lodge, preparing songs and dances, and calling upon spiritual power to bless the girl with endurance, generosity, and health. Elders instructed her in the responsibilities of womanhood, while medicine men invoked chants that linked her to the cycles of the earth and sky. The ceremony reinforced the central role of women in Apache society, placing them at the heart of cultural continuity. It also reaffirmed the bonds of the community, for the entire group participated, providing food, music, and support. In this way, individual transformation became a collective renewal. War rituals also carried spiritual weight. Before setting out on raids or hunts, warriors engaged in purification, bathing, fasting, and prayer to ensure success and protection. Weapons were blessed, songs were sung, and taboos observed. Certain animals were avoided before battle, certain foods forbidden, all to ensure that no imbalance would endanger the mission. Success in warfare was not only about skill, but about maintaining spiritual favour. Defeat could be attributed not merely to superior enemies, but to broken taboos, neglected rituals, or the displeasure of powerful beings. After battle, ceremonies of cleansing removed the pollution of violence, restoring harmony to the individual and the community. Death was another domain infused with ritual. The Apache believed that the spirit of the dead lingered, and that improper treatment of the body or neglect of ceremony could bring misfortune. Burials were conducted swiftly, often within a day, with possessions destroyed or buried to prevent the spirit from clinging to the living. Death was a powerful and dangerous force, and great care was taken to avoid disturbing the dead or speaking their names. Yet ceremonies also ensured that the spirit could journey on, joining ancestors in the spiritual realm. This balance between fear and respect shaped Apache attitudes toward mortality, ensuring that life continued in harmony with both the seen and unseen worlds. Music and song were the lifeblood of Apache spiritual practice. Chants preserved in memory for generations were invoked for healing, protection, fertility, and success. Each song carried power, words imbued with meaning that connected humans to spiritual beings. Drums, rattles, and voices created rhythms that guided dances, reinforced prayers, and marked the passage of ritual time. These performances were not for entertainment, but for transformation, ensuring that spiritual power was called forth and directed properly. The responsibility of preserving and transmitting these songs fell to elders and healers, who trained apprentices to carry the traditions forward. Through them, the knowledge of countless generations remained alive. The Apache also believed in supernatural beings who moved through the world, sometimes aiding and sometimes testing humans. Mountain spirits, often represented in ceremonies through masked dances, embodied protective power. They appeared in rituals to bless, heal, and guide, their dances dramatizing the presence of forces that stood beyond human sight yet within human experience. The dancers' masks and regalia transformed them into the very beings they represented, allowing the community to interact with spiritual powers directly. For those present, the boundary between the human and the divine blurred, reaffirming the interconnectedness of all existence. Dreams carried deep significance. They were messages from the spiritual world, guiding decisions, warning of dangers, or offering blessings. Individuals who received powerful dreams might be called to become healers, warriors, or ritual specialists. Dreams were shared with elders, interpreted within the framework of tradition, and acted upon with seriousness. Ignoring a dream could mean neglecting a message from powerful beings, risking imbalance or misfortune. In this way, even the private experience of sleep was integrated into the larger web of Apache spirituality. Outsiders often misunderstood these traditions, dismissing them as superstition or fearing them as witchcraft. Spanish missionaries attempted to suppress ceremonies, labeling them pagan, while later American officials banned rituals on reservations, yet the Apache preserved their traditions in secret, passing them down through oral teaching, hidden gatherings, and subtle adaptations. Even under immense pressure, the spiritual framework remained intact, for without it, the Apache could not exist as a people. Their survival was not only physical but spiritual, and maintaining ceremonies was as important as finding food or defending territory. The resilience of Apache spirituality lay in its adaptability. New experiences were integrated into the framework rather than displacing it. Horses, for example, became not only practical tools but beings with spiritual associations, requiring care and ritual acknowledgement. Contact with outsiders introduced new challenges and new powers to be understood, and the Apache responded by extending their spiritual worldview to encompass them. This adaptability allowed traditions to remain living and relevant, not fossilized relics of a past age, but evolving practices that met the needs of each generation. Spiritual beliefs and sacred traditions thus infused every aspect of Apache life. They guided birth, puberty, marriage, warfare, healing, and death. They shaped relationships with land, animals, and plants. They provided meaning in suffering, courage in battle, and hope in times of scarcity. More than anything, they reinforced the bonds of community, for ceremonies were collective acts that bound families, clans, and bands together in shared purpose. Without these traditions, the Apache would have been simply scattered families surviving in harsh lands. With them, they were a people, united not by centralized authority, but by a shared spiritual universe that made sense of their world and gave direction to their lives. As their story unfolded, these beliefs would sustain them through centuries of upheaval, conquest, and displacement. Spanish soldiers, Mexican militias, and American armies could challenge their lands and their bodies, but the spiritual traditions remained at the heart of who they were. Even when ceremonies were forced underground, even when children were punished for speaking their language, the songs, stories, and rituals endured. They carried forward the presence of changing woman, the power of sacred mountains, the guidance of dreams, and the protection of mountain spirits, ensuring that the Apache remained connected to the forces that had sustained them since their ancestors first walked into the Southwest. To speak of the Apache without speaking of warfare is impossible, not because they were defined solely by battle, but because war was woven into their survival as deeply as hunting, gathering, or ceremony. Outsiders remembered them above all as warriors, elusive, cunning, and terrifying, capable of striking without warning and vanishing into the land as though it had swallowed them whole. Yet to the Apache themselves, warfare was not random violence or bloodlust, but a necessary extension of life in an environment where resources were scarce, enemies were many, and survival required both defense and offense. From an early age, Apache boys were taught the skills that would prepare them for the responsibilities of war. Childhood games doubled as training, with boys shooting at small moving targets with bows, learning to track animals in dust and grass, and competing in foot races that honed endurance. Older men instructed them in stealth, showing them how to move silently across brush, how to read trails left by humans as easily as those of deer, how to recognize the faintest signs of movement in the distance. These lessons were not confined to moments of training, but embedded in daily life. Every hunt was a lesson in stalking, every camp was an exercise in vigilance, Every journey across the desert tested their ability to endure thirst and hunger. By the time a boy reached manhood, he had already been living in preparation for war. Apache warfare relied on tactics that outsiders often dismissed as cowardly because they did not match European models of massed armies and open battles. But these tactics were perfectly suited to the land and to the resources available. Surprise was their greatest weapon. Raiding parties struck quickly, choosing targets carefully, hitting when advantage was certain, and disappearing before enemies could organize a response. Ambushes were common, set in canyons, along river crossings, or at waterholes where enemies were most vulnerable. Scouts moved ahead of war parties, watching for signs of danger, identifying opportunities, and ensuring that no move was made without knowledge of the terrain. To outsiders, these methods seemed elusive and unfair. To the Apache, they were the only sensible way to fight against enemies who often outnumbered and outgunned them. Raiding was central to Apache warfare. Livestock, weapons, and food were valuable prizes that could sustain families for months. Horses in particular were prized, both for their practical use and for the prestige they brought to a warrior. Raids were carefully planned, often conducted at night or at dawn and executed with speed. Once the objective was achieved, the raiders withdrew, avoiding prolonged fights that could turn against them. Success depended on discipline and cooperation, each warrior knowing his role, each move coordinated by hand signals and experience. To settlers and soldiers, raids appeared as sudden, unprovoked acts of terror. To the Apache, they were deliberate strategies for survival in lands where the margin between plenty and starvation was narrow. Not all warfare was offensive. Defense of territory and family demanded vigilance. Camps were often located in places difficult for enemies to approach undetected: high valleys, mountain ridges, or canyons with narrow entrances. Women and children were moved quickly at the first sign of danger, with men taking up positions to delay or mislead pursuers. Decoys and feints were common, warriors drawing enemies into traps or away from vulnerable non-combatants. Knowledge of terrain was decisive. The Apache knew where every spring lay hidden, where trails branched, where escape routes led into wilderness. Enemies unfamiliar with the land often found themselves exhausted, cut off from water, and harassed by fighters who struck and retreated, wearing them down until they were forced to abandon the chase. Stealth was as valued as courage. A warrior who could move unseen, who could enter an enemy camp, take horses, and leave without a fight, was praised as highly as one who killed many in battle. Silence, patience, and cunning were marks of skill. A raid that ended without loss to one's own people was considered a victory greater than a bloody confrontation. Outsiders, seeking decisive battles, often misunderstood this, mistaking it for fear, but the Apache understood that survival depended on avoiding unnecessary losses. Every warrior was precious to his family, and reckless death diminished the band. War was a test of intelligence as much as of bravery. Warfare was also bound up with ceremony. Before a raid, warriors purified themselves, fasting, praying, and observing taboos. Songs were sung to invoke protection, and weapons were blessed. Certain foods were avoided, certain behaviors forbidden, lest they bring misfortune. Success depended not only on skill, but on spiritual balance. If a raid went badly, it might be attributed to broken taboos or neglected rituals. Afterward, cleansing ceremonies removed the pollution of bloodshed, ensuring that warriors returned to their families without carrying dangerous spiritual residue. In this way, warfare was never only physical, but part of a larger spiritual order that demanded constant attention. The Apache reputation as fighters spread quickly among their neighbours. Spanish colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries described them as the most persistent and dangerous raiders on the frontier. Pueblo communities knew both their friendship and their hostility depending on circumstances. To the east, the Comanche became their most formidable rivals, masters of mounted warfare who often clashed with Apache bands over territory and resources. These conflicts shaped Apache tactics further. teaching them the value of mobility and the necessity of adapting constantly to new threats. By the time American soldiers entered the region in the 19th century, Apache warfare had been honed by centuries of struggle against multiple enemies. Survival tactics extended beyond battle into every aspect of life. The Apache ability to live off the land astonished outsiders. They could travel long distances with minimal food, surviving on cactus fruits, mesquite beans, roasted agave, or even strips of rawhide softened in water. They knew how to find hidden springs, how to dig for water in dry riverbeds, how to read the movements of birds to locate sources of moisture. They carried little, moving light and fast, with knowledge of where food and water could be obtained along the way. This allowed them to outlast pursuers who relied on supply lines and wagons. Soldiers burdened with equipment often found themselves starved and thirsty, while Apache war parties moved like shadows, vanishing into mountains where no army could follow. Tracking was another essential skill. Apache warriors could read the ground like a book, identifying not only the presence of men or animals, but their number, speed, and direction. Broken twigs, displaced stones, faint impressions in dust, all revealed information to trained eyes. This skill gave them enormous advantage in both offense and defense. They could follow enemies for days, waiting for the right moment to strike, or they could detect pursuers long before they arrived, slipping away unseen. Outsiders marveled at this ability, often exaggerating it into myth, but for the Apache it was simply a matter of attention, observation, and generations of practice. Endurance was equally vital. Warriors were expected to run long distances, sometimes for hours, without rest, carrying only weapons and minimal supplies. They could climb rugged terrain, endure extreme heat or cold, and keep moving even when hungry or thirsty. This physical toughness was cultivated from youth through constant activity, games, and the demands of daily life. Endurance allowed them to pursue enemies, escape pursuers, or travel great distances to raid settlements. Combined with their knowledge of terrain, it made them nearly impossible to corner. The Apache also employed psychological tactics. They understood the value of fear, using sudden attacks, whoops, and displays of ferocity to unnerve enemies. Stories of their cruelty spread widely, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes grounded in reality. Captives might be taken, livestock driven off, and settlements burned. Such actions discouraged further encroachment and reinforced their reputation as formidable opponents. Yet it is important to remember that this was not indiscriminate violence, but part of a strategy of survival. By instilling fear, they reduced the likelihood of repeated attacks on their own people. Fear was a weapon as real as the bow or lance. The introduction of firearms changed Apache warfare, but not in the ways outsiders expected. At first, guns were rare, obtained through trade or captured in raids. Bows remained primary weapons well into the 19th century, valued for their silence, rapid fire, and reliability. A skilled archer could shoot several arrows in the time it took to reload a musket. As firearms improved, the Apache adapted, using rifles effectively but never abandoning their traditional skills. They combined old and new, relying on whichever weapon suited the moment. Horses, however, were the true revolution. With horses, raids became faster, hunts more productive, and warfare more mobile. Mounted Apache could strike across hundreds of miles, retreating before enemies could respond, transforming the scale of their operations. For centuries, Apache warfare and survival tactics baffled their enemies. Spanish, Mexican, and American forces, with all their numbers and technology, struggled to subdue small bands who refused to fight on conventional terms. Time and again, campaigns ended in frustration, settlements remained vulnerable, and generals lamented the inability to corner their elusive foes. What those outsiders failed to grasp was that the Apache were not simply fighting battles, but living a way of life perfectly adapted to their environment. Their warfare was not an aberration, but a continuation of the same skills that sustained them in hunting, gathering, and ceremony: stealth, patience, endurance, knowledge of land, and respect for spiritual balance. These were as important in war as in every other aspect of existence. This integration of war and survival gave the Apache resilience unmatched by many of their neighbours. They were never numerous, but they did not need to be. Their tactics ensured that small numbers could harass, defend, and endure against larger foes. Their survival strategies meant that even when driven into wilderness, they could persist. Their spiritual framework gave meaning to the risks and losses, ensuring that war was not merely chaos but part of a larger order, and their social structure, based on family, clan, and band, ensured that no defeat could destroy them entirely. One group might fall, but others carried on, the struggle continuing across generations. When Spanish explorers and colonists pushed northward into what is now the American Southwest, they carried with them ambitions that stretched across oceans. They sought gold, land, and converts, expanding the Empire of Spain into territories they barely understood. For the Apache, who had already established themselves across deserts, plains, and mountains, these intrusions marked the beginning of centuries of confrontation with European powers. The first encounters between Apache bands and Spaniards were shaped by mistrust, violence, and competing needs, setting patterns that endured for generations. The Spanish first entered the region in the 16th century, led by men like Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who in the 1540s sought the fabled 7 cities of gold. They travelled through lands that would later be Apache territory, though their direct contact with Apache bands was limited in those earliest years. What they did encounter, however, were Pueblo peoples and other settled groups who warned of raiders and enemies living in the surrounding wilderness. To the Spanish, the word Apache soon became a blanket term applied to many Athabascan-speaking groups, a label derived from the Zuni word meaning enemy. This outsider designation reflected how early colonists perceived them: dangerous, unpredictable, and opposed to Spanish expansion. The Spanish frontier was not just a line of soldiers, but also missions and presidios that aimed to extend both political and spiritual control. Priests established missions to convert indigenous peoples, while soldiers built forts to defend settlers and enforce authority. To the Apache, these outposts represented both threats and opportunities. On one hand, they brought foreign soldiers, strange weapons, and diseases that devastated native populations. On the other, they provided targets for raids, sources of livestock, weapons, and food. From the earliest contact, Apache strategies combined resistance with opportunism, refusing to submit while seizing what could be useful. Conflict escalated quickly. Spanish settlers viewed the Apache as hostile raiders who threatened their fragile frontier. For their part, Apache bands saw the Spanish as intruders who seized land, disrupted trade, and brought violence. Raids on settlements became a defining feature of the frontier, with Apache warriors striking swiftly, taking horses, cattle, and supplies, then vanishing into the wilderness. Spanish records are filled with accounts of these attacks, portraying the Apache as relentless enemies who defied control. Campaigns were launched to subdue them, but the results were often inconclusive. Soldiers accustomed to European warfare found themselves ill-suited to pursue mobile bands who refused open battle. The Spanish sought to impose order through a mixture of force and diplomacy. They launched punitive expeditions, burning Apache camps and killing or capturing those they could find. Yet they also attempted to negotiate peace by offering rations, goods, and protection in exchange for submission. Some Apache bands accepted these terms temporarily, moving near missions or presidios to receive food and supplies during lean times, but these arrangements rarely lasted. As soon as Spanish officials reduced their offerings or attempted to enforce stricter control, Apache families slipped away, returning to their independent way of life. The cycle of peace and war repeated again and again, each side using the other when convenient but never establishing lasting trust. Horses were among the most significant legacies of Spanish contact. Initially brought into the Americas by conquistadors, horses escaped or were captured, spreading rapidly across the plains and deserts. For the Apache, they were a revolution. Horses transformed hunting, allowing bison to be pursued with greater efficiency. They revolutionized warfare, enabling faster raids and more effective retreats. They also became symbols of wealth and status, with a man's prestige often measured by the size of his herd. The Spanish had introduced them as tools of conquest, but in the hands of the Apache they became tools of resistance, making them even more formidable opponents. Firearms also entered Apache life through contact with the Spanish, though more slowly. Muskets and later rifles were obtained through trade, capture, or alliances with intermediaries. At first they were clumsy and slow compared to bows, but over time Apache warriors mastered their use, integrating them into their arsenal without abandoning traditional weapons. Spanish officials feared this development, aware that every lost musket or stolen ammunition wagon increased the danger of raids. The flow of weapons into Apache hands made it ever harder for the Spanish to maintain dominance on the frontier. Disease was another more devastating consequence of contact. Smallpox, measles, and other European illnesses swept through Apache communities, just as they did among other indigenous peoples. Lacking immunity, entire bands were sometimes decimated, leaving survivors to regroup with relatives or merge into other groups. These epidemics weakened populations but did not break them. Instead, they reinforced the Apache reliance on mobility and kinship networks, enabling communities to endure even when numbers fell. Spanish officials sometimes interpreted disease as a sign of divine favor for their mission, but in practice it made the frontier more volatile, as weakened groups often turned to raiding to compensate for lost resources. Spanish attempts to control the frontier also ran into the reality of Apache social organization. Accustomed to negotiating with centralized rulers, Spanish officials struggled to understand that no single chief spoke for all Apache. Treaties signed with one band did not bind others. Peace with a handful of families near a presidio meant little to warriors hundreds of miles away who continued raiding. The decentralized nature of Apache society frustrated efforts to impose order, ensuring that the Spanish could never fully conquer them. This mismatch of expectations shaped relations for centuries, with Spaniards continually trying to force Apache leaders into roles that simply did not exist in their culture. Violence on the frontier was brutal and unrelenting. Apache raids often targeted livestock and goods, but sometimes included killing settlers or taking captives. Spanish retaliation could be equally harsh, with soldiers killing indiscriminately, enslaving women and children, and destroying camps. Captives became a tragic part of this cycle, sometimes adopted into Apache families, sometimes sold into slavery in Spanish markets. These exchanges of violence created deep mistrust that no treaty could erase. To the Apache, the Spanish were enemies who sought to enslave and destroy them. To the Spanish, the Apache were obstacles to empire, savages who had to be subdued. Neither side fully abandoned this view, ensuring that peace remained fragile at best. Despite the violence, cultural exchange occurred. Apache warriors admired Spanish weapons and clothing, sometimes adopting elements into their own attire. Spanish settlers learned to fear and respect Apache knowledge of the land, occasionally hiring them as scouts or guides when temporary alliances allowed. Trade in hides, horses and food persisted alongside raids, illustrating the complexity of the relationship. Yet these exchanges never erased the underlying conflict. The Spanish wanted submission, the Apache demanded autonomy. The result was a frontier locked in perpetual struggle. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which Pueblo peoples rose against Spanish rule, also shaped Apache relations with the colonists. Some Apache groups participated in the upheaval, seeing an opportunity to strike against their common enemy. The revolt temporarily drove the Spanish out of much of New Mexico, creating a power vacuum that Apache bands exploited. Though the Spanish eventually re-established control, they never fully regained dominance over the region, and Apache raids continued unabated. The revolt demonstrated that Spanish authority was not invincible, emboldening indigenous resistance across the frontier. Over time, the Spanish developed systems of peace by purchase, offering rations, goods, and gifts to Apache bands willing to settle near presidios. These arrangements sometimes created temporary calm, with families receiving food and clothing in exchange for limiting raids. But they also created dependence that the Spanish exploited, cutting off supplies to force compliance. For the Apache, such arrangements were pragmatic rather than permanent. They accepted goods when needed, but retained the option of returning to independent life. In this way, they turned Spanish attempts at control into yet another resource to be managed. By the 18th century, the Apache had established themselves as one of the most formidable forces on the northern frontier of New Spain. Spanish settlements lived in constant fear of raids. Military expeditions struggled to make progress. Missions faced repeated attacks. At the same time, the Apache had grown more skilled, more mobile, and more resilient through their use of horses, their integration of firearms, and their mastery of survival in harsh environments. The Spanish dreamed of bringing them under control, of converting them to Christianity and binding them to the empire. But the reality was that the Apache had become the masters of much of the frontier, dictating the terms of interaction as often as not. The encounters between the Apache and the Spanish set the stage for centuries of conflict that continued under Mexican and later American rule. The patterns established in those early centuries, raiding and retaliation, temporary peace and inevitable betrayal, cultural exchange and deep mistrust, became the rhythm of Apache relations with outsiders. The Spanish came with dreams of empire, but the Apache met them with a way of life that refused to yield, proving again and again that no foreign power could easily subdue a people who had made survival itself into an art. The 17th century was a period of turbulence across the northern frontier of New Spain, a time when Spanish missions and presidios spread steadily upward from Mexico, while indigenous peoples adapted, resisted, or sometimes collapsed under the pressures of colonization. For the Apache, these were years of constant conflict and adaptation, when survival demanded both relentless resistance and occasional compromise. They were not alone in this struggle. Other peoples like the Pueblo, the Navajo, and the Comanche were also shaping their destinies in response to the Spanish advance. But the Apache carved out a reputation as some of the most unyielding opponents of colonial expansion. In the early decades of the century, Spanish colonists still believed that the Apache could be subdued through a mixture of military campaigns and missionary work. Priests established missions along the Rio Grande, reaching into lands where Apache bands hunted, gathered, and raided. Soldiers attempted to patrol vast territories with only a few hundred men, building forts and relying on alliances with local peoples to defend their fragile settlements. The Apache, however, quickly learned how to turn these circumstances to their advantage. Missions and small outposts became targets for raids, their livestock easy to drive off, their stores of grain valuable prizes for families facing hunger. These strikes were not random but calculated, designed to obtain resources while undermining Spanish confidence in their frontier security. The Spanish often responded with punitive expeditions, sending detachments of cavalry and foot soldiers to chase raiders into the mountains. These expeditions were rarely successful. Apache warriors avoided pitched battles, striking from ambush and retreating before superior numbers could overwhelm them. They knew the land in ways their pursuers never could, using hidden trails, dry washes, and rugged canyons to escape. Soldiers carrying heavy equipment and relying on supply trains found themselves exhausted and demoralized, while Apache bands melted back into the wilderness. For every Spanish account boasting of victory, there were many more describing frustration, pursuit without success, and settlements left vulnerable once the soldiers withdrew. Resistance in this period was not only physical but also psychological. The mere presence of Apache raiders on the frontier, instilled fear that rippled through communities. Farmers hesitated to plant fields far from presidios. Merchants worried about transporting goods across lonely stretches of land. Missionaries wrote of constant danger, of converts frightened away by the threat of attack. This uncertainty eroded Spanish authority, making it clear that control over the frontier was never absolute. The Apache understood this well. By keeping settlers in a state of insecurity, they prevented the kind of permanent domination the Spanish hoped to establish. At the same time, Apache resistance was not uniform. Different bands responded in different ways depending on their circumstances. Some entered into temporary peace arrangements with Spanish officials, accepting rations and goods in exchange for limiting raids. These agreements might last a season, a year, or sometimes several years, but rarely longer. The Spanish referred to this system as peace by purchase, though in truth it was less about buying loyalty than about managing an unstable frontier. Apache leaders agreed when it suited them, ensuring food for their families during lean times, then returned to raiding when supplies dwindled or Spanish demands grew too heavy. The Spanish saw this as treachery. The Apache saw it as pragmatism. For a people whose survival depended on mobility and adaptability, no alliance was permanent, and no agreement could override the fundamental need to protect and provide for their families. The 17th century also witnessed significant shifts in the balance of power among native peoples. The rise of the Comanche to the north and east transformed the plains, bringing a new rival who would challenge Apache dominance of bison hunting and raiding territories. Though the Comanche had not yet reached the height of their power in the 1600s, their movements southward foreshadowed conflicts that would intensify in the next century. For the Apache, this meant they faced pressure not only from the Spanish, but also from indigenous rivals competing for the same resources. Resistance thus became a two-front struggle, against colonial powers and against neighbouring peoples seeking their own survival and expansion. One of the defining moments of the century was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. For decades, Pueblo communities had endured Spanish oppression, forced labour, and attempts to suppress their religious practices. When they rose up in coordinated rebellion, driving the Spanish out of New Mexico for more than a decade, the Apache observed closely. Some bands joined the revolt, striking Spanish settlements and missions alongside Pueblo allies. Others took advantage of the chaos to increase their own raiding, knowing that Spanish power had been weakened. The revolt demonstrated that Spanish authority was not invincible, emboldening Apache resistance and reinforcing the belief that persistence could outlast colonial ambition. Even after the Spanish eventually re-established control, their position was never as secure as before. The memory of 1680 lingered, reminding all that indigenous peoples could unite and defeat European forces, at least temporarily. Religion played a role in resistance as well. While Spanish missionaries sought to convert the Apache to Christianity, their efforts met with limited success. The mobile lifestyle of Apache bands made mission life unappealing, and their deep-rooted spiritual traditions provided meaning and cohesion that foreign priests could not replace. Some individuals may have accepted baptism or adopted elements of Christian practice, but these were usually pragmatic choices made to obtain goods or avoid punishment rather than true conversions. The Spanish lamented the stubbornness of the Apache, failing to recognize that their spiritual resilience was a form of resistance equal to any battle. By preserving their ceremonies, songs, and rituals, the Apache ensured that colonization would not erase their identity. Military resistance remained constant throughout the century. Spanish records are filled with accounts of raids that destroyed crops, carried off herds, and left settlers dead or captured. The presidios of El Paso, Santa Fe, and other northern outposts were repeatedly attacked, forcing colonial authorities to divert resources simply to maintain a fragile presence. Campaigns against Apache strongholds consumed men and money, but rarely achieved decisive victories. Time and again, Spanish officials wrote of the impossibility of defeating an enemy who refused to fight on conventional terms. The Apache did not seek conquest but survival, and in that they succeeded, outlasting every campaign thrown against them. Captivity was another dimension of this conflict. Apache warriors sometimes took captives during raids, both as a source of labour and as leverage in negotiations. Women and children were often adopted into Apache families, becoming part of the community. Others were ransomed back to their families or sold to Spanish settlers in exchange for goods. The Spanish in turn captured Apache men, women and children, enslaving them in settlements or using them as labour in mines and fields. This grim cycle intensified mistrust and hatred, ensuring that violence remained perpetual. For Apache families, the threat of losing loved ones to Spanish slavery was a constant reminder of why resistance was necessary. By the end of the 17th century, the Apache had demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite decades of Spanish campaigns, missions and settlements, they remained independent. Their decentralized social structure, mobile way of life, and mastery of survival in harsh environments made them nearly impossible to subdue. Spanish power reached into the region, but never fully controlled it. The frontier remained contested ground, with Apache bands dictating terms as often as they responded to colonial initiatives. Resistance had become a way of life, not merely a reaction to specific events, but an enduring stance against domination. The century closed with the Apache still firmly entrenched across their homelands, their reputation as fierce warriors secure, their traditions intact, and their determination unbroken. They had faced disease, raids by rival peoples, relentless Spanish campaigns, and the disruptions of colonial expansion. Yet they had survived, adapted, and continued to resist. The lessons of the 17th century shaped everything that followed, laying the groundwork for the conflicts of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Spanish would not abandon their ambitions, and new powers would soon emerge, but the Apache had proven that they could not be easily conquered, and that resistance was as much a part of their identity as kinship or ceremony. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the Apache world did not remain static. The pressures of Spanish colonization, the spread of rival tribes onto the plains, the changing flow of trade goods like horses and firearms, and the constant demands of survival reshaped how different Apache groups lived, moved, and fought. Out of these shifting circumstances, certain divisions within the Apache began to emerge more distinctly, crystallizing into recognizable identities that outsiders would come to know by names such as Lipan, Mescalero, and Chiricahua. These names did not describe separate nations in the sense of European states, but rather branches of a larger Apache family, each adapting to the particular landscapes and challenges of their regions. Together they illustrate the extraordinary flexibility and resilience of Apache culture, as the people adjusted to different environments without losing the common threads that bound them. The Lipan Apache established themselves on the eastern edge of Apache territory, in the plains and rolling hills of present-day Texas and northern Mexico. Their world was shaped by the bison herds that roamed the grasslands, vast resources that could sustain entire communities if harnessed properly. The Lipan became some of the most skilled bison hunters among the Apache, developing techniques for driving herds, processing hides, and storing meat. Horses, introduced through Spanish contact, expanded their reach dramatically, allowing them to hunt more effectively and to raid deep into Spanish and later Mexican territory. Yet this eastern position also placed them in constant conflict with the Comanche, whose rise to power on the plains was one of the most dramatic shifts of the 18th century. The Lipan found themselves pressed between the expanding Comanche and the encroaching Spanish, fighting on two fronts, yet refusing to abandon their identity. The Mescalero, by contrast, occupied the mountainous and desert regions of what is now southern New Mexico and West Texas. Their name derived from the mescal plant, the agave whose roasted hearts provided a reliable food source in harsh environments. The Mescalero built their seasonal cycles around the harvesting and roasting of this plant, gathering in communal celebrations that reinforced social bonds. Their mountains offered both resources and protection, serving as strongholds from which they could launch raids or retreat when threatened. The Mescalero became adept at navigating the transition zones between desert and mountain, hunting deer and antelope, gathering wild plants, and using their intimate knowledge of terrain to outmaneuver enemies. Their position placed them in contact with Spanish settlements along the Rio Grande and with other Apache bands, making them central players in the politics of the region. The Chiricahua emerged further west in the rugged mountains straddling the present-day border of Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Their homeland was a maze of high ranges, deep valleys, and desert basins, an environment that outsiders found forbidding, but that the Chiricahua knew intimately. This terrain gave them an extraordinary defensive advantage. Spanish, Mexican, and later American armies struggled to penetrate these strongholds, often finding themselves ambushed or exhausted long before they could bring the Chiricahua to battle. The Chiricahua developed a reputation as some of the fiercest and most elusive fighters among the Apache, a reputation that would endure well into the 19th century. Their leaders became legendary figures, remembered not only for their skill in war but for their ability to maintain independence in the face of overwhelming odds. The rise of these groups was not the result of deliberate political decisions, but of centuries of adaptation. As families and bands moved, split and regrouped, they adjusted to the demands of their surroundings. The Lipan leaned toward the plains, integrating bison hunting into their lifeways. The Mescalero thrived in mountain and desert ecotones, relying on agave and wild game. The Chiricahua rooted themselves in rugged mountain fortresses, building a defensive culture that outsiders found nearly impossible to defeat. Each branch maintained the fundamental elements of Apache society: matrilineal clans, flexible bands, spiritual traditions, and raiding economies, while emphasizing different aspects according to need. Spanish officials, observing this diversity, often struggled to categorize the Apache. They preferred to think of them as a single people, enemies to be subdued through force or diplomacy. Yet the reality was more complex. Treaties with one group did not bind another. Peace with the Lipan did not guarantee peace with the Mescalero. A temporary truce with the Chiricahua could be shattered by raids from other bands hundreds of miles away. This fluidity made it difficult for colonial authorities to establish consistent control, but it also created opportunities for Apache groups to play rivals against one another, extracting concessions or goods while preserving independence. The Lipan, in particular, developed a reputation for both fierce raiding and shrewd diplomacy. They raided deep into Spanish Texas, striking missions, settlements, and ranches, carrying off livestock and captives. Yet they also entered into alliances when it suited them, negotiating rations and goods from colonial authorities in exchange for temporary peace. Their position on the plains also brought them into early contact with French traders moving west from Louisiana, who supplied firearms and goods in exchange for hides and horses. These new trade networks gave the Lipan leverage, allowing them to resist Spanish dominance by turning to alternative sources of power. But the rise of the Comanche ultimately undermined their position as the newcomers swept across the plains with superior numbers, horsemanship, and alliances, forcing the Lipan into retreat and scattering them across Texas and northern Mexico. The Mescalero, occupying their mountain strongholds, became central targets of Spanish campaigns in the 18th century. Presidios were established to contain them, missions attempted to convert them, and military expeditions sought to crush their raids. Yet the Mescalero proved remarkably resilient. Their ability to vanish into the mountains, to endure long pursuits, and to launch counterstrikes kept the frontier unstable. Spanish accounts described them as tireless raiders who could never be subdued. At the same time, the Mescalero sometimes entered presidios to receive rations, goods, and protection, engaging in the same cycle of temporary peace and renewed conflict that characterized Apache relations across the frontier. Their very name, tied to the agave plant, symbolized their rootedness in their environment, a reminder that their strength came from intimate knowledge of the land. The Chiricahua rose to prominence in part because of the extraordinary defensibility of their homelands. The mountain ranges of southern Arizona and New Mexico provided natural fortresses where small groups could hold off much larger forces. Chiricahua warriors became masters of ambush, striking columns of soldiers in narrow passes, harassing them from ridges, and cutting off their supplies before disappearing into the wilderness. Spanish officials complained that every campaign against them ended in exhaustion and failure, with men and horses wasted while the Chiricahua remained defiant. Their leaders gained reputations not only as skilled warriors, but as tacticians who understood how to use terrain as a weapon. These traditions would later reach legendary heights in the resistance of figures like Cochise and Geronimo, but their roots lay in the 18th century, when the Chiricahua established themselves as a force that no colonial power could easily overcome. The rise of these groups also reflected the adaptability of Apache society to new technologies and opportunities. Horses, once rare, became central to their lifeways, not only for hunting and war, but for mobility and status. Firearms, increasingly available through trade and capture, were integrated into their arsenals, supplementing but never entirely replacing bows and lances. Livestock taken from Spanish settlements became sources of food, wealth, and trade goods. Raiding economies developed around these resources, with Apache bands seizing cattle and horses, trading them to other indigenous groups or settlers, and redistributing them within their communities. These activities were not mere plunder but part of a complex system of survival that sustained families and reinforced social bonds. As the 18th century progressed, the conflicts between Apache groups and Spanish colonists intensified. Presidios were expanded, campaigns launched, and treaties attempted, but the frontier remained unstable. The Lipan struggled against the rising Comanche, sometimes allying with the Spanish against their rivals, sometimes turning against both. The Mescalero continued to strike settlements along the Rio Grande, refusing to be confined to missions or reservations. The Chiricahua harassed Spanish and later Mexican forces, demonstrating time and again that their mountain fortresses could not be taken. These struggles defined the frontier, shaping the destinies of both colonists and Apache alike. By the time Mexican independence arrived in the early 19th century, the identities of the Lipan, Mescalero, and Chiricahua were well established. They were not isolated fragments but vital branches of the Apache family, each embodying the adaptability, resilience, and defiance that had defined their people for centuries. Their rise was not a story of separation from one another, but of diversification within a shared tradition, proof that the Apache could thrive in deserts, plains, and mountains alike. Outsiders might label them as distinct tribes, but within their communities the bonds of kinship, culture, and spirituality remained strong, ensuring that whatever divisions appeared on the surface, the Apache remained united in their determination to survive. When horses first appeared in the Southwest, they were unlike anything the Apache had ever seen. Brought north by Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century, they were introduced into a world that had relied for millennia on human endurance, foot travel, and dogs as beasts of burden. At first, horses were scarce and guarded closely by the Spanish, symbols of power as well as tools of war. But the frontier was vast, and over time animals escaped, were captured, or traded, spreading steadily across indigenous communities. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the horse had begun to reshape the very foundations of life across the plains and deserts, and no people would adapt more skillfully to this change than the Apache. Before the horse, Apache hunting required immense stamina and coordination. Bison hunts on foot meant driving herds into ambushes or traps, often at great risk and with uncertain success. Long-distance raids relied on endurance running, warriors covering miles over rugged terrain with little food or water. Mobility was constrained by the pace of walking, and the need to carry supplies limited how far families could travel. The arrival of the horse shattered these constraints, opening a new world of speed, mobility, and opportunity. For the Apache, who had already built their culture on flexibility and adaptation, the horse became not just a useful tool, but a transformative force that altered warfare, hunting, trade, and even identity. At first, only a few bands obtained horses, usually through raids on Spanish settlements or through trade with intermediaries like the Pueblo or Navajo. These early animals were precious, symbols of wealth and prestige. Owning even a small herd distinguished a family, providing them with greater ability to hunt and travel. Over time, however, horses spread more widely until they became integral to Apache life. The skills of horsemanship, breaking, riding, and breeding were mastered quickly. Young boys learned to ride as soon as they could walk, becoming expert horsemen capable of incredible feats of speed and endurance. Horses were not only transportation, but companions, deeply valued and cared for. They were fed, protected, and often given spiritual significance, woven into the Apache worldview as beings with power and agency. In hunting, the horse revolutionized efficiency. Mounted hunters could pursue bison with greater success, striking swiftly with bows or lances before the animals could scatter. A single hunt could yield enormous quantities of meat and hides, sustaining families for long periods and providing surplus for trade. Other game, such as deer or antelope, could also be pursued with speed that foot hunters could never match. This increased productivity strengthened Apache communities, reducing the risks of starvation and increasing their ability to support larger groups. It also enhanced their ability to engage in raiding economies, for horses themselves became prize commodities, captured, traded, and integrated into a network of exchange that stretched across the region. Warfare, however, was where the transformation became most dramatic. Mounted Apache warriors were nearly unstoppable in their mobility. They could cover vast distances in short periods, striking settlements hundreds of miles away, seizing livestock and retreating before defenders could respond. Spanish and later Mexican forces tied to supply lines and slower-moving infantry found themselves outmaneuvered again and again. Horses allowed Apache raiders to fight on their own terms, refusing set-piece battles, harassing enemies with hit-and-run attacks, and disappearing into the wilderness before pursuit could catch up. The very idea of a frontier army became tenuous, as soldiers realized they could not control territory against opponents who moved faster, struck harder, and refused to be pinned down. Apache tactics evolved to exploit these advantages fully. Mounted warriors could approach silently at night, surrounding settlements before a dawn raid, driving off herds, and escaping before reinforcements arrived. They could ambush supply trains, cutting off goods bound for distant presidios. They could shadow enemy columns for days, harassing them from a distance, striking vulnerable stragglers, and wearing them down through exhaustion. These methods turned horses into extensions of Apache strategy, tools for survival and resistance. By the 18th century, Spanish officials described Apache raiders as among the most formidable mounted warriors in the Americas, capable of striking terror across vast territories. The horse also reshaped Apache social life. Wealth became increasingly measured in herds, with large numbers of animals marking prestige and influence. Generosity remained a key value, and successful warriors distributed horses to relatives, strengthening kinship bonds and attracting followers. Marriage negotiations sometimes included the exchange of horses, reinforcing alliances between clans and bands. Boys and girls alike grew up with horses as part of daily life, tending herds, learning to ride, and internalizing the skills needed to survive in a world defined by mobility. Camps expanded their range, moving farther and faster than ever before, ensuring that no single place could bind the Apache to dependency. Trade expanded as well. Horses captured in raids or bred in herds were exchanged with other indigenous groups, spreading across the continent. Firearms, ammunition, cloth, and other goods flowed back in return. This trade was not limited to indigenous networks. It extended to Spanish and later Mexican settlers, who sometimes found it safer to exchange goods with Apache raiders than to resist them. The horse thus became both a weapon of resistance and a commodity in an economy that crossed cultural boundaries. It bound the Apache to larger regional systems while reinforcing their independence, for no colonial power could monopolize the flow of animals once herds had spread across the plains. The spiritual significance of horses also grew. They were seen as beings with power, requiring respect and ritual acknowledgement. Certain colours or markings were considered signs of special qualities. Horses were sometimes invoked in ceremonies for protection or success in raids. Stories and songs incorporated them, making them part of the Apache's sacred universe. Just as mountains, animals and plants carried spiritual presence, so too did these animals, now inseparable from daily life. The horse was not merely adopted as a tool but integrated fully into the Apache worldview, becoming part of who they were. The Spanish recognized the danger of this transformation, but were powerless to stop it. Efforts to restrict horses to colonial settlements failed as animals continued to escape or be stolen. Campaigns to suppress raiding only accelerated Apache acquisition, as every defeated patrol left animals in their enemies' hands. By the 18th century, Spanish records revealed deep frustration, describing how Apache bands seemed to multiply in strength, their mobility making them nearly impossible to contain. The very animal the Spanish had brought as an advantage of conquest had become the instrument of resistance, turning the frontier into a battleground they could never fully control. The coming of the horse also altered relations among different Apache groups. Bands with larger herds gained prestige and influence, attracting followers and strengthening their capacity for raids. Horses allowed families to move farther and faster, increasing contact between distant bands and reinforcing the sense of a shared Apache identity, even as regional differences developed. At the same time, competition for herds could cause tensions, both within Apache society and with neighbouring peoples. Raids for horses became common, both against outsiders and among rivals, reflecting the centrality of the animal to survival and status. The Lipan, Mescalero and Chiricahua each adapted the horse to their environments in distinctive ways. The Lipan, living on the plains, became especially adept at mounted bison hunting, integrating the animal into their seasonal cycles. The Mescalero used horses to expand their raiding reach into settlements along the Rio Grande, striking swiftly before retreating into mountain strongholds. The Chiricahua, already skilled at mountain ambushes, used horses to increase the range of their raids, extending their influence deep into Mexican territory. In each case, the horse amplified existing strengths, making them more formidable and more independent. By the time American expansion reached the Southwest in the 19th century, the Apache had lived with horses for generations. Their identity as mounted warriors was firmly established, their reputation as raiders and fighters shaped by centuries of adaptation. Soldiers and settlers alike described them as some of the most skilled horsemen they had ever encountered, capable of feats of endurance and speed that seemed impossible. The transformation had been so complete that it was difficult to imagine Apache life without horses, though in truth this adaptation was only a few centuries old. What mattered was not the length of time, but the depth of integration. The horse had been absorbed into Apache culture as thoroughly as any element of their ancestral traditions, becoming inseparable from who they were. This transformation was not without its costs. Horses required grazing land and water, increasing competition for resources. Herds attracted enemies, both human and animal, demanding constant vigilance. Raiding economies built around livestock sometimes intensified cycles of violence, drawing relentless retaliation from Spanish, Mexican, and later American forces. Yet for the Apache, the benefits outweighed the risks. Without horses, their ability to resist colonial domination would have been far weaker. With them, they became some of the most feared and respected fighters in the history of the Americas. In the end, the coming of the horse was not simply a technological change, but a cultural revolution. It reshaped every aspect of Apache life, from hunting and warfare to trade and ceremony. It reinforced their independence, expanded their reach, and gave them the means to resist foreign powers for centuries. What began as a foreign introduction became, in Apache hands, a defining element of their identity, a symbol of resilience and adaptability. The horse, once the tool of conquistadors, became the partner of a people who refused to yield, carrying them across deserts and plains, into battles and ceremonies, into survival and legend. The Apache world was built on mobility, kinship, and survival, but in the 18th and 19th centuries it also became defined by the rhythm of raiding and the networks of trade that linked them to both enemies and allies across vast distances. Outsiders often portrayed Apache raiding as pure violence, acts of savagery meant only to terrorize settlers and soldiers. Yet to the Apache themselves, raiding was an economic system, as structured and deliberate as farming was to agricultural peoples. It was not random but carefully planned, not merely destructive but productive, feeding into cycles of redistribution, alliance, and survival. Alongside raiding came trade, sometimes with the very people who called them enemies, demonstrating that Apache relations with outsiders were never as simple as constant war. At the heart of the raiding economy was livestock. Horses, cattle, and mules were the lifeblood of colonial and later Mexican and American frontiers, and they became equally vital to Apache life. Raiding parties targeted ranches, missions, and settlements where herds could be seized quickly. Horses expanded Apache mobility, cattle provided food and hides, and both could be traded for other goods. Raids were planned with precision, often launched at night or before dawn, when defenders were least prepared. Scouts gathered information, warriors organized routes of attack and retreat, and the objective was not necessarily to kill, but to take as much livestock as possible and escape before soldiers could respond. A successful raid could sustain a band for months, while also increasing prestige for the warriors who led it. Captives were another element of this economy. During raids, men, women, and children were sometimes taken alive. Some captives were adopted into Apache families, filling gaps left by war, disease, or loss, and over time they became indistinguishable from their new kin. Others were ransomed back to their families, traded to settlers, or used as labour. The practice was not unique to the Apache. It was part of a wider indigenous tradition across the Americas, where captives served both economic and social functions. For the Spanish and later Mexicans and Americans, however, it fueled the image of the Apache as ruthless raiders. Yet for the Apache themselves, it was one of many strategies to ensure survival in a world where populations were small, enemies numerous, and resources scarce. Raiding was not only about material gain, but about reinforcing social bonds. Warriors gained prestige not simply by fighting bravely, but by returning with goods that could be redistributed among their families and clans. Generosity was a mark of leadership, and successful raiders demonstrated their worth by sharing livestock, weapons, or other spoils. This redistribution reinforced networks of loyalty, ensuring that bands remained cohesive and that leaders maintained influence. In this way, the raiding economy was inseparable from Apache social structure. It was not an individual pursuit of wealth, but a communal strategy for survival, binding together families, clans, and bands. The Spanish, Mexicans, and later Americans tried to suppress raiding through military campaigns, but they also became unwilling participants in the economy it generated. Livestock stolen in raids was sometimes sold back to settlers or traded through intermediaries, creating a cycle where the very victims of raiding ended up contributing to its continuation. Some frontier settlers preferred to trade with the Apache rather than resist them, recognizing that commerce could bring peace, at least temporarily. In this way, the frontier became a zone of constant negotiation, where violence and trade coexisted, often involving the same people. A man might lose cattle to a raid one month, and trade with Apache warriors the next, a reflection of the fluid boundaries between war and economy. The geography of Apache raiding extended across borders. Bands struck deep into northern Mexico, targeting ranches and towns in Chihuahua, Sonora, and beyond. These raids became infamous in Mexican records, described as devastating incursions that left settlements abandoned and entire regions depopulated, yet they also fueled economies, as livestock taken in Mexico was brought north, traded to other indigenous groups, or sold to settlers in New Mexico and Texas. The border was not a barrier, but a highway for Apache mobility, allowing them to exploit divisions between colonial, Mexican, and later American authorities. Each power struggled to defend its frontier, but none could fully prevent raids that moved across hundreds of miles with astonishing speed. Trade with other indigenous peoples was equally significant. The Apache exchanged livestock, hides, and captives with groups such as the Pueblo, the Navajo, and even sometimes the Comanche, despite being frequent rivals. These exchanges provided goods that the Apache did not produce themselves, such as agricultural crops, woven cloth, or items obtained from European traders. Through these networks, the Apache became integrated into a larger regional economy, one that extended beyond their immediate raids into systems of exchange that crossed cultural boundaries. Even as they resisted colonial powers, they were part of the same economic currents that sustained those powers. Firearms became a crucial commodity in this system. Obtained through trade, capture, or intermediaries, they increased the lethality and effectiveness of Apache raiding. Ammunition was scarce and valuable, often obtained by selling stolen livestock or captives. This made trade essential, for even the most successful warriors could not maintain their arsenals without access to external supplies. Guns did not replace bows and arrows, which remained useful for stealth and hunting, but they added another dimension to Apache warfare, making raids even more formidable. Spanish and later Mexican officials attempted to use trade as a tool of control. They offered rations, goods, and protection in exchange for peace, creating a system where Apache bands might settle near presidios temporarily to receive supplies. But these arrangements rarely lasted. As soon as rations were reduced or demands increased, families slipped away, resuming their independence and their raids. To the Spanish, this was treachery. To the Apache, it was simply another form of exchange, one more opportunity to obtain resources without surrendering autonomy. The cycle of peace and war continued, each side using the other as best they could. The raiding economy was not without its risks. Soldiers responded with punitive campaigns, striking back at Apache camps, destroying food stores, and killing or capturing families. Retaliation could be devastating, yet it rarely ended raiding altogether. Instead, it often escalated the cycle of violence, with Apache warriors seeking revenge for losses inflicted on their people. The economy of raiding was thus inseparable from the economy of war, each feeding the other, ensuring that the frontier remained unstable for centuries. By the 19th century, raiding into Mexico reached extraordinary intensity. Chiricahua and Mescalero bands in particular struck repeatedly, travelling hundreds of miles into Sonora and Chihuahua, seizing thousands of head of livestock and retreating into their mountain strongholds. Mexican communities, already weakened by political instability and limited military resources, found themselves unable to defend effectively. Entire regions were depopulated as settlers abandoned vulnerable towns, leaving vast stretches of land open to Apache use. These raids became legendary, both feared and admired, symbols of Apache power and defiance. American expansion into the Southwest added new dimensions to this economy. Settlers brought more livestock, more goods, and more opportunities for raiding. At the same time, the US Army attempted to impose stricter control, launching campaigns aimed at breaking Apache independence. Yet even under these pressures, raiding remained central to survival. The transition from Spanish to Mexican to American authority did not alter the fundamental reality. The Apache lived in a world where resources were uneven, enemies were many, and raiding was the most reliable way to ensure survival. The cross-border nature of Apache raiding also gave them leverage in diplomacy. Mexican officials sometimes sought US cooperation to control Apache incursions, while American authorities used raids into Mexico as justification for their own military interventions. The Apache exploited these divisions, moving across borders with ease, escaping pursuit by retreating into territories beyond the reach of their enemies. This mobility frustrated both governments, who often blamed each other for failing to control the frontier. For the Apache, it was simply another form of survival, using the landscape and political boundaries to their advantage. What outsiders saw as chaos was, for the Apache, an economy as structured as any agricultural or mercantile system. It had rules, strategies, and purposes. Raids were planned, resources were distributed, trade networks were maintained. The risks were great, but the rewards were essential, ensuring that families could eat, that warriors gained prestige, and that communities remained cohesive. It was a system born of necessity, but it became a defining feature of Apache identity, shaping how they interacted with the world around them. The raiding economy also reinforced Apache independence. By relying on what they could take and trade, they avoided dependence on outsiders. They did not need to submit to colonial rule, for they had their own means of obtaining what was necessary. This independence came at a high cost, inviting constant conflict and retaliation. But it also preserved their way of life for centuries in the face of relentless pressure. The Apache did not build cities or empires, but through raiding and trade they sustained a system that was every bit as durable and effective for their needs. As the 19th century wore on, the United States expanded its power, deploying larger armies and establishing more permanent control over the Southwest. The days of a large-scale raiding would eventually decline under this pressure, but the legacy remained. The raiding economy had sustained the Apache for centuries, enabling them to resist Spanish conquest, Mexican campaigns, and American expansion. It had given them the means to thrive in lands that others found inhospitable, and it had bound them into networks of trade and exchange that stretched across borders and cultures. More than a strategy of war, it was a way of life, one that demonstrated the ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability that defined the Apache people. The Apache never lived in isolation. Their lands stretched across deserts, plains, and mountains that were already home to other peoples long before Europeans arrived. To the west and north were the Pueblo communities, farmers who built towns of stone and adobe and practiced intricate ceremonies tied to the cycles of planting and harvest. To the east were the Comanche, who rose to dominance on the southern plains during the 18th century and became one of the fiercest rivals the Apache would ever face. To the south and across the borderlands of Mexico lived groups of Apata, Yaqui, and other indigenous peoples, each with their own histories of resistance and accommodation to Spanish and later Mexican rule. For the Apache, relations with these neighbours were as important as their conflicts with colonial powers. They shaped alliances, wars, trade, and the very rhythm of survival. The Pueblo were among the first neighbours the Apache encountered as they migrated into the southwest. Living in permanent settlements along the Rio Grande and in scattered villages across New Mexico and Arizona, the Pueblo offered a sharp contrast to the mobile, hunting and gathering lifestyle of the Apache. Their irrigated fields of corn, beans, and squash provided a stable food base, while their multi-storied dwellings symbolized permanence and rootedness. For the Apache, who valued mobility, these towns represented both opportunity and vulnerability. On one hand, they were sources of food, tools, and goods that could be acquired through trade or raids. On the other, they were potential allies against common enemies, especially the Spanish. The relationship oscillated constantly between cooperation and hostility, never settling into a single pattern. Trade between Apache and Pueblo communities was long-standing. The Apache offered hides, meat, and wild foods in exchange for agricultural produce, pottery, and woven goods. This exchange benefited both sides, allowing each to obtain resources they could not easily produce themselves. But when scarcity struck or relations soured, raids replaced trade. Apache warriors targeted Pueblo fields and storehouses, seizing corn and other supplies to sustain their families. Pueblo defenders resisted as best they could, but the constant threat of raids added to the pressures they already faced from Spanish colonists and missionaries. For the Spanish, Apache attacks on the Pueblo complicated efforts to maintain control, forcing them to defend both their allies and their own settlements from the same enemy. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 brought these dynamics into sharp relief. When the Pueblo rose up against Spanish oppression, killing missionaries and soldiers and driving the colonists from New Mexico, some Apache bands joined the rebellion, seizing the chance to strike at their common enemy. Others took advantage of the chaos to launch independent raids, exploiting the weakening of Spanish power. For a time, the revolt created space for greater Apache freedom, as Spanish authority collapsed and the frontier became more fluid. Even after the Spanish re-established their presence in the 1690s, the revolt remained a reminder that indigenous peoples could resist colonial domination, and that alliances between different groups, however fragile, could shift the balance of power. Relations with the Comanche were even more complex and often far more violent. In the early 17th century, the Comanche were still a branch of the Shoshone living further north. But as they acquired horses and migrated southward, they transformed into one of the most formidable mounted powers in North America. By the 18th century, they dominated the southern plains, expanding into territories that the Apache had once roamed more freely. This brought the two peoples into direct conflict, as both sought control of hunting grounds, raiding routes, and access to trade. The result was generations of warfare that reshaped the balance of power across the plains in the southwest. The Comanche excelled in mounted warfare, mastering the use of horses to such an extent that Spanish observers compared them to cavalry of the Old World. Their raids swept across Texas, Oklahoma, and northern Mexico, rivaling and often surpassing Apache incursions. For the Apache, this rising power was a grave threat. Bands that had once dominated the eastern plains found themselves pushed westward or forced into harsher environments. The Lipan in particular bore the brunt of Comanche expansion, suffering defeats that fractured their communities and scattered them into smaller groups. By the late 18th century, the Comanche had effectively supplanted the Apache as the dominant force on the southern plains, relegating their rivals to the margins. Yet even amid this rivalry, moments of accommodation occurred. Apache and Comanche bands sometimes entered into temporary truces, usually to facilitate trade or to confront shared enemies such as the Spanish or Mexicans. Horses, weapons, and captives flowed between them in complex exchanges that blurred the line between war and commerce. But these truces were fragile, often breaking down as quickly as they were formed. The memory of conflict ran deep, and the competition for resources remained too fierce for lasting peace. The enmity between Apache and Comanche became one of the defining rivalries of the Southwest, shaping the strategies of colonial powers who sought to manipulate one against the other. Beyond the Pueblo and Comanche, the Apache also interacted with numerous other indigenous groups. To the south in Mexico lived the Opata, Yaqui, Mayo, and other peoples who had long histories of resistance to Spanish rule. The Apache raided their settlements as readily as they raided Spanish ranches, seizing livestock and goods, yet they also traded with them, exchanging hides, horses and captives for food and weapons. These relationships were pragmatic, shifting with circumstance. Alliances were forged when useful, abandoned when no longer needed. The fluidity of these interactions reflected the Apache commitment to survival above all else, adapting to each situation without binding themselves to permanent arrangements. To the west, the Apache encountered the Yavapai, Pima, and Papago peoples of Arizona. These groups practiced a mixture of farming and foraging, living in river valleys and deserts where resources were scarce but carefully managed. Relations between Apache and these neighbors were often hostile, marked by raids and reprisals, but they also included moments of exchange. The Apache were not alone in practicing raiding economies. Many of their neighbours also relied on similar strategies. The frontier was not a simple division between raiding Apache and peaceful farmers, but a complex mosaic of peoples adapting to harsh environments and foreign pressures in overlapping ways. The Navajo, close linguistic relatives of the Apache, offered another important connection. Sharing Athabascan roots, the Navajo had also migrated into the southwest, settling in the mesas and canyons of present-day Arizona and New Mexico. Like the Apache, they combined foraging, hunting, and raiding, but they also developed extensive farming and herding, especially after adopting sheep from the Spanish. Relations between Navajo and Apache bands were varied, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive. Their linguistic and cultural similarities allowed for intermarriage and alliance, but their proximity also led to disputes over resources. Spanish and later American officials often conflated the two, grouping them together as similar threats, though each maintained distinct identities. The constant thread through all these relationships was pragmatism. The Apache did not define themselves by eternal alliances or permanent enemies. They adapted to shifting circumstances, treating each group according to the opportunities and threats they presented at a given time. This flexibility allowed them to survive in a world of constant change, where colonial powers rose and fell, epidemics swept through populations, and rivals pressed in from all directions. The Apache could be raiders one season and trading partners the next, allies in one conflict and enemies in another. Outsiders often viewed this as inconsistency or treachery, but to the Apache it was common sense, a refusal to be bound by rigid structures that might threaten survival. By the early 19th century, these intertribal relations had shaped the Apache into a people both deeply interconnected with their neighbours and fiercely independent. The Pueblo remained important trading partners and occasional allies. The Comanche had forced them westward, transforming the balance of power on the plains. The Navajo provided cultural kinship and competition in equal measure. The peoples of northern Mexico bore the brunt of their raids but also participated in trade. Through it all, the Apache retained their identity, refusing to be subsumed by neighbours or colonizers alike. Their interactions with these groups also influenced how outsiders perceived them. Spanish, Mexican, and American officials often tried to manipulate these relationships, seeking allies among the Pueblo or Comanche to use against the Apache. Sometimes they succeeded, forging temporary coalitions that struck at Apache camps. Other times they failed, as alliances broke down or shifted unexpectedly. What they never fully understood was that the Apache would always prioritize their own survival, making and breaking connections as needed, never surrendering autonomy to anyone else. This ability to navigate the complex web of relations with both indigenous and colonial powers was a key reason why the Apache endured for centuries in the face of overwhelming odds. When Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, the balance of power on the northern frontier shifted in name but not in reality. For the Apache, the new republic to the south was simply the latest in a line of foreign powers claiming dominion over lands they had never fully controlled. The Apache had outlasted centuries of Spanish campaigns, and they entered the Mexican period with the same strategies of resistance, raiding, and adaptation that had sustained them for generations. But the Mexican frontier was fragile in ways the Spanish had not been, and the years that followed brought both new opportunities and new dangers, as the Apache confronted a state that was often weaker than its predecessor, yet more desperate to assert control. Mexico inherited vast northern territories stretching across Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Texas, regions that were sparsely populated and difficult to defend. Spanish presidios still dotted the frontier, but many were undermanned and underfunded. The missions that had once sought to convert and settle indigenous peoples were in decline, their influence eroded by decades of resistance. Into this vacuum stepped the Apache, continuing to raid, trade and maneuver as they had before, but now against a state struggling to consolidate its independence while facing internal turmoil. The Mexican government, beset by political instability, regional revolts, and financial weakness, could never devote consistent resources to the frontier, leaving settlers vulnerable and soldiers demoralized. Apache raids into Mexico intensified in this period, becoming a defining feature of life along the borderlands. Bands from the Chiricahua, Mescalero, and Lipan in particular struck deep into Sonora and Chihuahua, seizing horses, cattle, and captives. These raids were not small-scale incursions, but large, coordinated expeditions that could involve dozens or even hundreds of warriors. Mexican accounts describe entire towns abandoned after repeated attacks, ranches stripped of their herds, and roads left impassable due to fear of ambush. For many frontier communities, the Apache became the most immediate threat to survival, eclipsing even political disputes or rivalries with other indigenous groups. The Mexican response was inconsistent. At times, authorities attempted to continue the old Spanish policy of peace through rations and trade, offering supplies in exchange for calm. At other times, they launched harsh military campaigns, sending soldiers into the mountains to punish raiding bands. But with resources stretched thin, these expeditions rarely achieved lasting results. Soldiers often lacked pay, equipment, or even food, and morale collapsed in the face of elusive enemies who struck suddenly and vanished into rugged terrain. The government also turned increasingly to civilian militias and local settlers for defense, further fragmenting the frontier and creating cycles of violence that were difficult to control. One of the most infamous Mexican strategies was the use of scalp bounties. In an attempt to incentivize local defense, authorities in Sonora and Chihuahua offered payments for Apache scalps, encouraging settlers, mercenaries, and rival indigenous groups to hunt them. This brutal policy led to widespread violence, as bounty hunters targeted not only raiding parties, but also non-combatants, sometimes killing peaceful groups or even non-Apache peoples to claim rewards. The Apache responded with vengeance, intensifying their raids and retaliating against communities that had participated in the killings. Far from solving the problem, scalp bounties deepened the cycle of hatred, leaving scars that endured for generations. Despite this hostility, the Mexican frontier was not defined solely by war. Trade remained an essential element of Apache survival, and bands frequently exchanged livestock, hides, and captives with settlers willing to risk dealings with them. Some communities found it more practical to cooperate than to resist, creating unofficial markets where stolen goods were bought and sold. These exchanges blurred the lines between enemies and partners, as the same settlers who suffered raids might also profit from trade. The Mexican frontier, like the Spanish before it, became a zone of negotiation as well as conflict, with Apache raiders integrated into local economies even as they were denounced as threats. The instability of the Mexican state created further opportunities. Frequent changes of government in Mexico City meant that frontier policy shifted constantly, with new officials arriving, promising peace or war, and then departing before anything was accomplished. This inconsistency reinforced Apache independence, as they quickly learned that no treaty or campaign would last. Each administration sought quick solutions, but none had the capacity to impose lasting control. For the Apache, this meant they could continue their way of life with relatively little interruption, striking where they chose, retreating when necessary, and exploiting the divisions of their enemies. The rise of the Comanche also shaped Apache relations with Mexico. As Comanche power spread across the plains, they launched massive raids into northern Mexico, often overshadowing those of the Apache. This sometimes provided cover for Apache operations, as Mexican authorities struggled to distinguish between different raiding groups, or were too overwhelmed to respond to both simultaneously. At times, Apache and Comanche even competed for the same targets, further complicating the situation. For Mexican settlers, the distinction often mattered little. Both groups represented relentless threats that the government seemed powerless to stop. The Mexican frontier was also shaped by shifting alliances. Some Apache bands occasionally negotiated with Mexican officials, agreeing to limit raids in exchange for supplies, weapons, or recognition. Others allied temporarily with settlers against rival indigenous groups, finding short-term advantages in cooperation. Yet these arrangements rarely endured, as mistrust and conflicting interests quickly resurfaced. The Apache remained committed to their independence, unwilling to bind themselves permanently to agreements that might compromise their survival. From their perspective, the Mexican government was just another power trying to control them, no different from the Spanish before it or the Americans who would come later. For Mexican frontier communities, living under the shadow of Apache raids was a constant ordeal. Families built their homes with defense in mind, always alert for the sound of horses approaching at night. Travel between towns was dangerous, with merchants hiring armed escorts to protect caravans. Stories of raids circulated widely, fueling fear and resentment. At the same time, some settlers learned to adapt, negotiating directly with Apache bands, or even intermarrying in rare cases. The frontier was never a simple line of conflict, but a complex web of interactions where survival demanded flexibility from all sides. As the 19th century advanced, Mexico's hold on its northern territories grew weaker. The loss of Texas in the 1830s, the US invasion in the 1840s, and the eventual cession of vast lands to the United States after the Mexican-American War in 1848 left the frontier in turmoil. For the Apache, these events brought new challenges and new enemies, but during the Mexican period they had already demonstrated their ability to thrive amid instability. Their raids had reached unprecedented scale, their trade networks had extended across borders, and their resilience had once again proven that no foreign power could fully subdue them. The Mexican frontier was thus not merely a backdrop to Apache history, but a central arena where their strategies of survival played out. In the towns and ranches of Sonora and Chihuahua, in the presidios and missions struggling to endure, in the markets where stolen goods were quietly exchanged, the Apache shaped the destiny of entire regions. Their raids depopulated settlements, their trade sustained economies, and their resistance forced governments to divert resources again and again. For nearly half a century after independence, Mexico could claim sovereignty over the north, but in reality, much of that land remained Apache country, contested ground where the state's writ barely reached. The legacy of this period is one of both defiance and tragedy. The Apache preserved their independence through relentless raids and careful negotiation, yet they also endured the horrors of scalp bounties, massacres, and constant retaliation. They remained feared and respected, woven into the stories of every frontier community from Texas to Sonora. The Mexican state sought to bring order, but instead found itself continually undermined, its weakness exposed by a people who refused to yield. For the Apache, the Mexican frontier was simply another chapter in a longer story, one that would soon continue with the arrival of a new and even more powerful rival to the north. When the United States emerged as the new power in the Southwest after the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848, the Apache faced yet another foreign government claiming control over their lands. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded vast stretches of territory from Mexico to the United States, including present-day Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas, areas that were at the heart of Apache homelands. For the Apache, this change of rulers did not alter their fundamental reality. They had resisted the Spanish for centuries, fought the Mexicans for decades, and now they would confront the Americans with the same strategies of endurance, raiding, and resistance that had long defined their way of life. But the scale of the new challenge was unlike anything they had faced before, for the United States possessed resources, manpower, and determination that surpassed earlier powers, and it was willing to commit them to campaigns aimed at breaking Apache independence once and for all. American expansion into the Southwest came in waves. First came soldiers and surveyors, mapping the new territories and establishing military posts to protect travel and commerce. Then came settlers, ranchers and miners, drawn by the promise of land, cattle and minerals. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 accelerated migration, as thousands of people crossed through Apache country on their way to the Pacific. Each wave brought new pressures, new conflicts, and new demands for military protection. For the Apache, whose lands lay across these routes and resources, the intrusion was immediate and unavoidable. They responded as they always had, with raids against livestock, caravans and settlements, striking at the newcomers as they had struck at Spanish and Mexican frontiers before. The US Army soon recognized that the Apache would not yield easily. Soldiers sent to the southwest found themselves facing the same challenges that had frustrated their predecessors: vast distances, harsh environments, and opponents who refused to fight on conventional terms. Apache warriors struck suddenly, then vanished into mountains and deserts that soldiers barely understood. Supply lines stretched thin, forts were isolated, and morale quickly eroded in the face of an enemy who could not be cornered. Reports from officers echoed those of Spanish and Mexican commanders before them, describing endless pursuits, ambushes, and a sense of futility against a foe who seemed always one step ahead. Yet the Americans were different in one crucial respect. They possessed far greater resources and were willing to sustain long campaigns, rotating in fresh troops, building more forts, and developing strategies that combined military force with diplomacy and deception. The establishment of military posts across New Mexico and Arizona marked a new stage in the struggle, as the US Army sought not only to defend settlers but to impose systematic control. Forts like Fort Sumner, Fort Stanton, and Fort Apache became bases from which soldiers launched patrols into Apache territory, attempting to restrict their mobility and cut off their access to resources. The goal was not simply to repel raids, but to end them altogether by forcing the Apache onto reservations, where they could be monitored and controlled. One of the key strategies employed by the US Army was relentless pursuit. Commanders recognized that the Apache relied on mobility and knowledge of terrain to evade enemies. To counter this, they deployed units of cavalry trained to move quickly, covering long distances in harsh conditions. Scouts, often drawn from rival indigenous groups or from captured Apache themselves, were used to track raiding parties and guide soldiers through unfamiliar landscapes. The army also adopted harsher measures, destroying food supplies, burning crops, and killing livestock in an attempt to starve the Apache into submission. These tactics reflected a determination to break the cycle of resistance by making survival itself impossible outside the reservation system. For the Apache, the arrival of the US Army intensified the cycle of raiding and retaliation. Raids into American settlements, ranches, and mining camps became common. Both to obtain resources and to resist encroachment, soldiers responded with campaigns that often targeted not only warriors, but entire communities, killing women and children or removing them to distant forts. Each side fueled the other's determination, ensuring that peace was elusive. Some Apache leaders sought to negotiate, recognizing the overwhelming power of the United States, but others insisted on continued resistance, unwilling to abandon their independence without a fight. The Bascom Affair of 1861 symbolized the escalating tensions. When a boy was kidnapped and livestock stolen near an American settlement, Lieutenant George Bascom accused the Chiricahua leader Cochise of responsibility. Despite a lack of evidence, Bascom attempted to seize Cochise and his family, sparking a confrontation that led to bloodshed on both sides. The incident ignited a war between Cochise's band and the US Army that would last more than a decade, marked by raids, ambushes, and battles across Arizona and New Mexico. For the Americans, it revealed the difficulty of distinguishing between peaceful and hostile Apache, and for the Apache, it confirmed the duplicity of the new power in their lands. The Civil War temporarily shifted American attention away from the Southwest, as troops were withdrawn to fight in the East. This gave the Apache space to resume raids with greater intensity, targeting weakened garrisons and vulnerable settlements. But once the war ended, the US Army returned in force, determined to impose control. The campaigns that followed were larger and more sustained than those of earlier decades, reflecting the growing importance of the region to American expansion. Railroads, mining operations, and ranching enterprises demanded security, and settlers pressured the government for decisive action. The result was a series of relentless military operations aimed at breaking Apache resistance once and for all. The reservation system became the centerpiece of US policy. By confining Apache bands to designated lands, the government sought to end their mobility, disrupt raiding economies, and force them into dependence on rations. Leaders were pressured to surrender, often through promises of protection or supplies, only to find themselves removed far from their homelands. Resistance was met with brutal campaigns, as soldiers pursued holdouts into the mountains, destroying villages and capturing families. Over time, more and more Apache were forced onto reservations, though many resisted fiercely, escaping whenever possible to resume their independence. The US Army campaigns were not only military but psychological. By targeting women, children, and food supplies, soldiers aimed to break the will of entire communities, not just warriors. This strategy mirrored the harsh policies once employed by the Spanish and Mexicans, but the Americans carried it out with greater resources and persistence. Apache survivors described the terror of soldiers burning their camps, seizing their families, and driving them into starvation. Yet they also remembered the resilience of their people, the determination to fight on even when outnumbered and outgunned. For the Apache, the struggle against the Americans was not merely about land, but about the very survival of their way of life. Despite the overwhelming power of the United States, Apache resistance endured for decades. Leaders like Cochise, Victorio, Nana, and later Geronimo carried on the fight, refusing to surrender completely. Their bands struck deep into Mexico as well as American territory, crossing borders to evade pursuit and prolong the struggle. The US Army responded with ever larger campaigns, sometimes coordinating with Mexican forces, but victory remained elusive. Again and again, soldiers believed they had broken the Apache, only to face renewed resistance from survivors who refused to accept defeat. By the late 19th century, however, the balance had shifted irreversibly. The sheer scale of American power, combined with the relentless pressure of military campaigns, gradually wore down Apache resistance. Reservation confinement, starvation, and the capture of families weakened the will to fight. Leaders who had once commanded fear and respect found themselves negotiating surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The US Army had succeeded where the Spanish and Mexicans had failed, not through superior tactics alone, but through the weight of resources, manpower, and a national determination to secure the frontier at any cost. The American expansion and the US Army campaigns thus marked a turning point in Apache history. For centuries, they had resisted foreign powers, relying on mobility, raiding, and adaptation to preserve their independence. Against the United States, they fought with the same determination, but this time the enemy possessed the capacity to sustain campaigns indefinitely, to build forts across the land, to pour in settlers and resources that could not be matched. The Apache fought valiantly, but the tide of history had shifted against them. The frontier that had once been theirs was being transformed into a landscape of ranches, mines, and railroads, policed by an army that would not withdraw. Yet even in the face of this overwhelming pressure, the Apache did not surrender easily or quickly. Their resistance became legendary, remembered in stories of ambushes, raids, and battles that defied the expectations of generals and terrified settlers. They demonstrated again and again that survival was possible against impossible odds, that a people rooted in mobility, kinship, and knowledge of the land could withstand empires for centuries. The US Army campaigns marked the beginning of the end of their independence, but not the end of their identity. For even as they were confined to reservations, the Apache carried with them the memory of resistance, the skills of survival, and the determination that had sustained them through every wave of conquest. Among the many names that stand out in Apache history, few carry the weight and legend of Mangus Coloradus. To his people, he was more than a war chief. He was a symbol of unity at a time when unity was difficult, a voice that could rally scattered bands, and a leader whose stature embodied both physical strength and political wisdom. To the outsiders who faced him, he was one of the most formidable opponents the American West ever produced. A man who commanded fear not only because of his size and presence, but because of the persistence and skill with which he resisted invasion. His life and leadership illustrate both the power and the tragedy of the Apache struggle in the 19th century, a story of resilience, betrayal, and the determination of a people fighting to remain free. Born around 1793, Mangus Coloradus belonged to the Mimbreño band of the Chiricahua Apache. His name, often translated as Red Sleeves, referred to the red shirt he was known to wear, though others connected it to the coppery tone of his skin. He grew to be a towering figure, literally and figuratively, said to stand well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and an imposing presence. Accounts from Mexicans and Americans alike describe him as a giant among men, his physical strength matched by his commanding voice and piercing eyes. But size alone did not make him a leader. What set Mangus apart was his ability to navigate the shifting realities of a world where the Apache were pressed by Mexicans, Americans, and rival indigenous groups, yet still found ways to endure. In the early years of his leadership, Mangus Coloradus confronted the Mexican frontier. For decades, Chiricahua bands had raided into northern Mexico, seizing livestock and captives from settlements in Sonora and Chihuahua. Mangus led his people in these campaigns, proving himself a skilled tactician who could plan raids with precision, strike quickly, and retreat into the mountains before enemies could respond. He earned his reputation not only through battlefield success, but through his ability to protect his people, guiding them to safety, ensuring their survival, and distributing the spoils of raids with fairness. In a world where leadership depended on respect rather than hereditary authority, Mangus demonstrated again and again that he was worthy of following. Mexican authorities came to know his name well, associating him with some of the most devastating raids of the 1820s and 1830s. They responded with scalp bounties and punitive campaigns, but Mangus evaded them, his people disappearing into the Sierra Madre and re-emerging to strike again. To Mexican settlers he was a scourge, a constant threat who seemed untouchable. To his own people, he was the shield that protected them from annihilation. His leadership in this period was shaped by necessity, for the Chiricahua faced unrelenting pressure from scalp hunters, soldiers and settlers, yet under Mangus's guidance they not only survived but maintained their strength. The arrival of the Americans in the southwest after the Mexican-American War introduced new dynamics. Mangus Coloradus recognized immediately that this was not simply another foreign power to be endured. The United States brought settlers in far greater numbers, soldiers with more resources, and a determination to build permanent control over Apache lands. At first, Mangus attempted to avoid unnecessary conflict. He met with American officials, even offering friendship in hopes of avoiding war. In the early 1850s, he attended councils with US representatives, expressing willingness to coexist if his people's independence and lands were respected. But as so often in Apache history, promises were broken and violence escalated. The catalyst for open hostility came with the expansion of mining in Apache territory. Gold discoveries in New Mexico and Arizona drew thousands of prospectors who poured into the mountains and valleys that had long sustained the Chiricahua. They cut down trees, diverted water, hunted game, and established settlements without regard for Apache claims. Miners and settlers clashed with Apache families, and retaliations quickly spiraled into open conflict. In one infamous incident in 1851, Mangas himself was lured into a parley with miners near Santa Rita del Cobre, only to be whipped and humiliated. For a leader of his stature, such an insult was intolerable. From that moment on, Mangas abandoned any hope of peace with the Americans and committed himself fully to resistance. The years that followed saw Mangas Colorades at the height of his power. He forged alliances with other leaders, including his son-in-law Cochise, creating a formidable coalition of Chiricahua bands capable of striking across vast distances. Together they launched raids against American settlements, stagecoaches and military posts, spreading fear across New Mexico and Arizona. Mangas was not reckless. He chose his targets carefully, striking where the enemy was weak, retreating before superior forces could gather, and using his deep knowledge of the land to keep his people safe. His ability to coordinate multiple bands, uniting them in common cause, was rare in Apache history, where independence was deeply valued. Yet under Mangas's guidance, cooperation flourished, strengthening the Apache position against overwhelming odds. The American response was predictable: more forts, more soldiers, more campaigns. Yet Mangas and his allies proved elusive. Again and again, columns of soldiers marched into the mountains, only to find empty camps, ambushes waiting in canyons or trails that vanished into wilderness. The frustration of officers mirrored that of Spanish and Mexican commanders before them, as Mangas used mobility, stealth and endurance to outmaneuver forces many times his size. His reputation grew not only among his people, but among his enemies, who came to see him as the embodiment of Apache resistance. But the Americans were determined, and the tide of settlement continued to grow. By the 1860s, Mangas was an older man, his body marked by decades of war, but his spirit unbroken. He had become a symbol not only for the Chiricahua, but for the Apache more broadly, a leader whose very name carried weight across the Southwest. In 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, Mangas entered into talks with US officials under a flag of truce, reportedly seeking peace after years of conflict. But the meeting ended in betrayal. He was taken prisoner by soldiers at Fort McLean in New Mexico, despite his status as a peace emissary. That night guards tortured and killed him, shooting him after scalding his feet and mutilating his body. His death sent shockwaves through Apache communities, a brutal reminder that no promise from the Americans could be trusted. For the Apache, the killing of Mangas Colorades was not just the loss of a leader, but an act of profound treachery. His stature had made him a unifying figure at a time when unity was rare. His wisdom had guided bands through decades of hardship. His alliances had strengthened their ability to resist. His betrayal and murder confirmed the worst fears about American intentions and fueled further resistance. Cochise, already a powerful leader, carried on the struggle with renewed determination, and younger warriors drew inspiration from the memory of Mangas's defiance. The legacy of Mangas Colorades endures not only in the stories of battles and raids, but in the image of a leader who embodied the Apache determination to remain free. He was both warrior and diplomat, willing to seek peace but unafraid of war, capable of uniting disparate groups while respecting their independence. His size and strength made him legendary, but it was his vision that made him great, a vision that saw beyond immediate survival to the larger struggle of his people against foreign domination. For outsiders, Mangas was remembered as a fierce enemy, one of the most dangerous opponents the frontier ever produced. For his own people, he was remembered as a protector, a leader who stood tall, literally and figuratively, in defense of their way of life. His death marked a turning point in the Apache Wars, a moment when betrayal replaced even the possibility of trust. Yet his spirit lived on in the leaders who followed, in the bands that continued to resist, and in the memory of a people who had endured centuries of conquest and still refused to yield. The leadership of Mangas Colorades illustrates the paradox of Apache history in the 19th century. They were too few to defeat the overwhelming power of Mexico or the United States, yet too determined to be subdued quickly. Their leaders could inspire unity, but unity was always fragile. Their enemies could promise peace, but peace was always betrayed. Mangas himself embodied both the possibilities and the limits of Apache resistance, a man whose vision and courage prolonged their independence, but whose murder revealed the ruthless determination of those who sought to end it. In the end, his story is not simply one of defeat, but of endurance. He lived through the transition from Spanish to Mexican to American rule, and through it all he kept his people free for as long as possible. He demonstrated that leadership could be earned not by inheritance but by respect, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resistance was possible. The memory of Mangas Coloradas remained long after his death, carried in the songs and stories of his descendants, in the determination of leaders like Cochise and Geronimo, and in the enduring spirit of the Apache people who continued to fight for survival. Cochise's name stands as one of the most enduring in the long story of Apache resistance. To his people, he was not only a respected chief, but a figure whose leadership, intelligence, and courage helped preserve the independence of his band through some of the most turbulent years of the 19th century. To outsiders, especially American settlers and soldiers, he became both a symbol of terror and eventually of reluctant respect, a man who could not be cornered or defeated easily. His reputation, already formidable, was cemented by a single event in 1861 that came to be known as the Bascom Affair, a confrontation that ignited years of war and established Cochise as one of the greatest Apache leaders in memory. Cochise was born around 1805, a Chiricahua Apache of the Choconen band. Like many Apache leaders, he rose to prominence not through inheritance but through skill, wisdom, and the respect of his people. He was described as tall, with a commanding presence and a dignified bearing. Accounts from both Apache oral tradition and outsider observers note his intelligence, his ability to weigh decisions carefully, and his insistence on fairness within his community. By the middle of the 19th century, he had become a central leader among the Chiricahua, closely allied with Mangas Coloradas, who was his father-in-law. Together, the two men formed a powerful partnership, guiding their people through the escalating conflicts with Mexican settlers and, after 1848, with the Americans who now claimed the Southwest. For much of the 1850s, Cochise managed to maintain a fragile peace with American authorities. He understood the overwhelming numbers and resources the United States could bring to bear, and he did not seek unnecessary conflict. He met with soldiers and officials, negotiated agreements, and even allowed some settlers to move through Chiricahua lands unmolested, provided they respected his people and did not encroach too deeply. But the peace was always precarious, resting on fragile trust in a frontier where misunderstandings and betrayals were common. The breaking point came in early 1861, when a raid near a ranch owned by John Ward resulted in the kidnapping of Ward's stepson and the theft of livestock. Ward immediately blamed the Chiricahua, though evidence was thin and the perpetrators may have been Coyotero Apache or another group entirely. U.S. Army Lieutenant George Bascom was ordered to investigate and recover the boy. Young, ambitious, and inexperienced, Bascom rode into Apache Pass near present-day Arizona with a small detachment of soldiers determined to confront Cochise. Cochise, confident in his innocence and perhaps still hopeful of maintaining peace, agreed to meet Bascom under a flag of truce. He brought members of his family with him, including his wife and children, as a sign of good faith. The meeting began with formality, but Bascom quickly accused Cochise of responsibility for the kidnapping and demanded the return of the boy and the stolen livestock. Cochise denied involvement, insisting that his band had nothing to do with the incident, but offered to help track down the real culprits. Bascom, suspicious and unwilling to accept his word, attempted to seize Cochise and his family as hostages. What followed was a moment of betrayal that would change the course of Apache-American relations for years. Cochise, realizing the trap, drew a knife and cut his way out of the tent, escaping despite being surrounded. His family, however, was taken prisoner. Enraged and humiliated, Cochise immediately took his own hostages from nearby settlements, capturing several Americans to exchange for his relatives. Negotiations broke down, and violence escalated quickly. In the days that followed, both sides executed hostages, and blood was shed in a cycle of retaliation. What might have been resolved through diplomacy instead erupted into open war. The Bascom affair became a turning point. For Cochise, it confirmed that the Americans could not be trusted, that even under a flag of truce they would resort to treachery. For the Americans, it hardened perceptions of the Apache as unrelenting enemies. The violence set off a decade of conflict known as the Apache Wars, during which Cochise and his followers struck relentlessly against military posts, stagecoach lines, and settlements across Arizona and New Mexico. The US Army, distracted by the Civil War, struggled to contain him, and settlers lived in constant fear of raids. Cochise's leadership in these years was marked by tactical brilliance. He understood the strengths and weaknesses of his enemy, and he used his knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. His warriors launched ambushes in mountain passes, attacked wagon trains, and disappeared into the wilderness before soldiers could mount a pursuit. One of the most famous incidents was the ambush of a stagecoach near Apache Pass in 1861, in which Cochise's men killed several passengers and further cemented his reputation as a relentless foe. Yet Cochise was not reckless. He balanced war with diplomacy, sometimes negotiating with officials when it served his people's interests. He sought alliances with other Apache bands, reinforcing ties with Mangus Coloraders and coordinating raids across wide areas. He also weighed the costs of war, aware that constant conflict brought suffering to his people as well as to his enemies. His leadership was defined not only by courage in battle, but by the ability to navigate the complexities of survival in a world where enemies surrounded the Apache on all sides. The death of Mangus Coloraders in 1863, murdered under a flag of truce by US soldiers, only deepened Cochise's resolve. He carried on the struggle with even greater determination, vowing never to surrender or trust the Americans again. For nearly a decade, he led his people in a campaign of resistance that made him one of the most feared figures in the Southwest. His raids reached deep into both American and Mexican territory, keeping the frontier in constant turmoil. Settlers abandoned towns, stage lines were disrupted, and military commanders expressed frustration at their inability to bring Cochise to heel. By the late 1860s, however, the balance of power began to shift. The Civil War had ended, and the US Army could now devote greater resources to the Southwest. More forts were built, more troops deployed, and campaigns became increasingly relentless. Cochise continued to resist, but the pressure grew. His people faced starvation as soldiers destroyed food supplies, and constant pursuit made mobility more difficult. Still, Cochise held out, refusing to surrender when other leaders had been forced onto reservations. His reputation as a man who could not be broken only grew, inspiring both fear and admiration. Eventually, exhaustion and pragmatism led Cochise to seek a resolution. In the early 1870s, negotiations with General Oliver O. Howard and the Indian agent Thomas Jeffords opened the door to peace. Cochise agreed to move his people to a reservation in southeastern Arizona, within their traditional homeland, rather than being exiled far away as had been the fate of other bands. This arrangement, known as the Chiricahua Reservation, represented a rare instance in which an Apache leader was able to secure terms that preserved some measure of autonomy. Cochise lived out his final years there, maintaining authority over his people until his death in 1874. The legend of Cochise is inseparable from the Bascom affair, the spark that transformed a tenuous peace into a decade of war. But it is also larger than any single event. His life embodies the qualities of leadership that defined Apache resilience: courage, intelligence, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to independence. He fought not for conquest, but for survival, not for personal glory, but for the freedom of his people. His ability to unite bands, to outmaneuver enemies, and to secure favourable terms at the end of his life made him one of the greatest figures in Apache history. For the Americans, Cochise became both a fearsome enemy and later a grudgingly respected figure. Soldiers who fought against him acknowledged his skill, while officials who negotiated with him recognised his dignity and determination. For his people, he remained a symbol of resistance, a leader who never surrendered and who preserved their presence in their homeland at a time when so many others were exiled. The Bascom affair may have begun with betrayal, but Cochise ensured that it ended with the Apache still standing, still defiant, still unbroken. His story continues to resonate because it reflects the broader history of the Apache themselves. They were a people repeatedly betrayed, repeatedly targeted, yet repeatedly resilient. Cochise's defiance in the face of treachery, his ability to endure through years of war, and his insistence on preserving his people's dignity mirror the larger arc of Apache survival. The legend of Cochise is not merely a tale of battles won or lost, but of the unyielding spirit of a people who refuse to vanish, even when faced with overwhelming power. When the name Geronimo is spoken, it carries with it the weight of one of the most iconic figures in Native American history. To the Chiricahua, Apache, and their allies, he was a medicine man and warrior, a man whose visions and courage made him a symbol of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. To the Mexicans and Americans who fought against him, he became the embodiment of Apache resistance, a figure whose very name struck fear across the borderlands. His life spanned the final era of Apache independence, and his actions defined the last great wars of resistance in the Southwest, a struggle that stretched into the late 19th century and captured the attention of the world. Geronimo was born in 1829 near the headwaters of the Gila River, a member of the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua. His birth name was Goyawe, often translated as the one who yawns, but history would remember him by the name Mexican soldiers gave him, Geronimo, a distortion of Geronimo cried out in fear or prayer during battle. From his youth, he was immersed in the traditions of his people, trained in the skills of hunting, raiding, and survival. But he was also known for his spiritual gifts, experiencing visions and dreams that marked him as a man with special powers. As he grew, he became both a spiritual leader and a warrior, embodying the Apache belief that the physical and spiritual worlds were inseparable in the struggle for survival. The defining trauma of his early life occurred in 1851, when Mexican soldiers attacked his camp near Llanos, Chihuahua. In the raid, his wife, children, and mother were killed. Geronimo later described this moment as the turning point of his life, when grief and rage fused into an unshakable resolve to fight. From that day forward, he carried a personal vendetta against Mexicans, launching raids into Sonora and Chihuahua with ferocity that became legendary. It was in these years that he first earned the name Geronimo, as his enemies, invoking the Saint Jerome in desperation, cried out his name during battle. For Geronimo, the fight was not abstract but deeply personal, a matter of avenging the loss of his family and ensuring that his people would never again be so vulnerable. Geronimo was not a chief in the formal sense. Apache leadership did not work through centralized authority or hereditary rule. Instead, he was a medicine man and a war leader, someone whose visions inspired confidence and whose courage in battle drew followers. He did not command all Apache bands, nor did he claim to, but his reputation as a fearless fighter and a man of supernatural gifts gave him influence far beyond his immediate kin. He became part of a larger coalition of leaders, including Cochise, Victorio, Nana, and later Nietzsche, the son of Cochise. Together, these figures carried on the struggle against Mexican and American forces in the latter half of the 19th century. The 1870s and 1880s were decades of intense conflict, as the US Army sought to impose control over the Apache through the reservation system. After the death of Cochise in 1874, the Chiricahua were confined to the Chiricahua Reservation in Arizona, but within a few years the government closed that reservation and moved them to San Carlos, far from their mountain homelands. The conditions at San Carlos were deplorable: poor soil, insufficient rations, disease, and constant surveillance by officials who showed little respect for Apache traditions. Geronimo and many others refused to accept this confinement. Time and again, they escaped the reservation, fleeing back to the mountains and deserts that had sustained them for generations. Each escape reignited conflict, as raiding and battles resumed across the borderlands. Geronimo's band became notorious for their ability to evade capture. Pursued by thousands of soldiers, both American and Mexican, they crossed back and forth across the border, using the rugged Sierra Madre mountains of northern Mexico as their stronghold. These campaigns became the stuff of legend, with Geronimo's name splashed across newspapers in the United States and even in Europe. To settlers and soldiers, he seemed almost supernatural in his ability to avoid capture, appearing where least expected, raiding ranches and towns, then vanishing into terrain that no army could conquer. To his own people, his survival was proof of his spiritual power, confirmation that the spirits guided and protected him. The US Army committed enormous resources to pursuing Geronimo. At times, more than 5,000 soldiers were deployed, supported by Apache scouts recruited from rival bands. Despite this overwhelming force, Geronimo and his followers, never more than a few dozen warriors at a time, held out for years, frustrating generals and politicians alike. His campaigns became a symbol of defiance, the last great struggle of Native America against the tide of US expansion. But they also took a terrible toll on his people, who endured constant pursuit, starvation, and loss. Women and children suffered most, as soldiers destroyed camps, burned food supplies, and forced captives into exile. One of Geronimo's most notable escapes came in 1885, when he and a small band fled the San Carlos reservation once again. For more than a year they ranged across Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, pursued relentlessly by US and Mexican forces. The newspapers followed every move, turning Geronimo into a household name. Some portrayed him as a savage menace, others as a heroic symbol of resistance against oppression. The attention only increased the pressure on the US Army to bring the conflict to an end. Generals like George Crook and later Nelson Miles devoted enormous effort to capturing him, sending columns deep into Mexico, relying on Apache scouts, and employing new tactics of relentless pursuit. Geronimo's final surrender came in 1886, under circumstances that remain debated. After months of pursuit, he was cornered in the Sierra Madre. Promises were made that if he surrendered, he and his followers would be treated fairly and allowed to return to their people in time. Weary from years of fighting, faced with dwindling resources and the suffering of his band, Geronimo agreed. He surrendered to General Nelson Miles, bringing an end to the last major Apache resistance. But once again, promises were broken. Instead of returning to their homeland, Geronimo and hundreds of other Chiricahua were shipped east as prisoners of war. They were sent first to Florida, then to Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where they remained in captivity for decades. Geronimo lived out the remainder of his life as a prisoner, though his fame continued to grow. He became a public figure, appearing at fairs, exhibitions, and even the inauguration of President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905. He sold autographs, posed for photographs, and became a symbol of the vanished frontier. Yet behind the spectacle was a man who had lost his homeland, his freedom, and much of his family. He died in 1909 at Fort Sill, far from the mountains and deserts that had defined his life. To the end, he remained both revered and controversial, admired for his courage, condemned for his violence, remembered as one of the last great warriors of the American frontier. The wars led by Geronimo were not just about one man's defiance, but about the final chapter of a centuries-long struggle. By the time of his surrender, the Apache had endured Spanish, Mexican, and American campaigns. They had seen leaders like Mangus Coloradas murdered, Cochise betrayed, Victorio hunted down, and countless families confined to reservations. Geronimo's resistance was the last flame of independence, a refusal to submit even when all odds pointed to defeat. His struggle embodied the resilience of the Apache spirit, their determination to survive no matter the cost. To many Americans of the time, Geronimo was the archetype of the savage warrior, a figure to be feared and despised. Yet over time, perception shifted. As the frontier closed and the wars ended, he came to be seen as a symbol of courage, a man who resisted overwhelming power in defense of his people. His name entered popular culture, shouted by paratroopers as they leapt from planes, invoked as a symbol of daring and defiance. In this way, Geronimo's legacy outlived the wars themselves, transforming him from a feared enemy into a legend recognized around the world. For the Apache, the memory was more complex. He was both a hero and a controversial figure, admired for his bravery but criticized by some for the suffering his campaigns brought to his people. His decisions to flee reservations and resume raiding prolonged their independence, but also prolonged their hardship. Yet whatever judgments are made, his role in history is undeniable. He kept alive the fight for freedom long after other leaders had fallen, ensuring that the Apache story would not end quietly, but with a defiance that echoed across continents. The last wars of resistance, led by Geronimo and his contemporaries, marked the end of an era. After his surrender, no major Apache band remained free. The reservation system became the reality of life, and the US government imposed its authority across the Southwest. Yet the memory of resistance remained, carried in stories, songs, and traditions, reminding future generations that their ancestors had fought with extraordinary courage. Geronimo's life, from the grief of 1851 to the surrender of 1886, encapsulates both the tragedy and the resilience of the Apache experience, a testament to a people who refused to vanish even when pressed to the very edge of survival. By the late 19th century, the Apache world, which had endured centuries of upheaval, entered one of its darkest and most transformative periods. The relentless pressure of Spanish conquest, the years of conflict with Mexico, and finally the decades of war with the United States left the Apache surrounded on all sides, their independence shrinking with each passing year. The defeats of leaders like Mangas Coloradas, the negotiations of Cochise, and the final surrender of Geronimo signaled that a new reality had arrived. The long walks, the forced surrenders, and the confinement on reservations were not isolated moments, but part of a broader policy of breaking Apache resistance by uprooting them from their homelands and scattering them across distant lands. It was an era that tested their endurance in ways even war itself had not, demanding survival under the crushing weight of exile and confinement. The concept of removal was not unique to the Apache. Across the 19th century, the United States had pursued a policy of forcing indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories, whether the Cherokee on the infamous Trail of Tears or the Navajo on their own long walk to Bosque Redondo. The Apache experienced their own versions of these forced marches, events remembered not only for their brutality, but for the way they shattered communities and attempted to erase cultural identities. For a people defined by mobility, freedom, and intimate ties to their landscapes, the forced relocations were devastating, an attempt to sever them from the very foundation of their way of life. One of the most notorious relocations occurred after the defeat of the Mescalero Apache in the 1860s. In 1862, the US Army, under General James Carleton, ordered the Mescalero to relocate to Bosque Redondo near Fort Sumner in eastern New Mexico. The Mescalero, like their Navajo neighbors, were forced to undertake long marches across hostile terrain, with soldiers driving them like prisoners. Many perished along the way from hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. When they arrived at Bosque Redondo, they found conditions unlivable. The soil was poor, the water brackish, and disease spread rapidly. The government expected them to farm, but the land could not sustain crops. Starvation became constant, and the people who had once thrived in the mountains and deserts of the Southwest now found themselves wasting away on a barren plain. By 1865, the Mescalero abandoned Bosque Redondo, slipping away under cover of night and scattering back into their old homelands. The attempt to confine them there was a disaster, remembered as one of the most tragic failures of US Indian policy. Other Apache groups experienced similar ordeals. After the death of Cochise, the Chiricahua were promised a reservation in their homeland, but this arrangement lasted only a few years. In 1876, the government closed the Chiricahua reservation and forced the people to move to San Carlos, a barren stretch of land in Arizona derisively called Hell's 40 Acres. The relocation was another form of a long walk, as families were uprooted from their mountain strongholds and driven into a place where resources were scarce and surveillance constant. At San Carlos, Apache families faced not only hunger and disease, but also the erosion of their independence. Government agents sought to impose strict rules, suppress traditional practices, and turn them into farmers dependent on rations. For a people who valued autonomy, the confinement was suffocating. Many refused to stay. Again and again, groups slipped away from San Carlos, fleeing back into the mountains. These escapes often reignited war, as raiding resumed and soldiers were dispatched to hunt them down. Leaders like Victorio, Nana, and Geronimo rose from these cycles of resistance, each leading bands that refused to accept life on the reservation. Their eventual defeats, however, only led to further relocations, as survivors were captured and moved to new reservations even farther from their homelands. By the 1880s, many Chiricahua had been shipped east as prisoners of war, beginning decades of confinement in Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma. The surrender of Geronimo in 1886 marked a decisive turning point. His band, numbering only a few dozen warriors but carrying enormous symbolic weight, represented the last holdouts of Apache independence. When they laid down their arms, the US Army treated them not as defeated foes to be reconciled, but as prisoners of war to be exiled. Nearly 500 Chiricahua, including women and children who had not fought, were transported by train to Florida. The journey itself was another long walk of sorts, a forced relocation across thousands of miles into a humid climate utterly alien to them. Disease ravaged the prisoners, with malaria, tuberculosis, and other illnesses claiming countless lives. Families were torn apart, traditions disrupted, and the sense of dislocation profound. Over the following decades, the Chiricahua were shuttled from place to place, never allowed to return to their homeland. From Florida, they were moved to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and later to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. At each stage, they remained prisoners, watched by soldiers, dependent on government rations, their freedom extinguished. The generations born in captivity grew up without direct knowledge of the mountains and deserts their ancestors had fought for. Yet even in these conditions, Apache identity endured. Families held on to their language, their songs, and their stories, passing them down as acts of resistance against cultural erasure. For the Lipan, Jicarilla, and other Apache groups, the story of surrenders and relocations followed its own course but echoed the same themes. The Lipan, once prominent on the southern plains, were shattered by Comanche expansion and relentless military campaigns. Survivors were forced onto reservations in Texas and later absorbed into other Apache groups or displaced further. The Jicarilla, living in the mountains of northern New Mexico, resisted until the 1880s, when they too were confined to a reservation. Each branch of the Apache faced its own version of surrender, long walks and confinement, all part of the larger policy of fragmenting their independence and reshaping them into subjects of federal control. The psychological impact of these surrenders cannot be overstated. For a people whose culture emphasized freedom of movement, the ability to live according to one's own choices, and the sanctity of ancestral lands, the confinement to reservations was a profound loss. The long walk symbolized not only physical displacement, but the attempt to break the spirit of the Apache, to strip them of the mobility that had defined their survival for centuries. Yet time and again, even within the constraints of reservations, they found ways to resist, through maintaining traditions, through storytelling, through persistence in the face of hardship. Reservation life was marked by constant struggle. Government agents controlled rations and supplies, often using them as tools of coercion. Christian missionaries sought to replace Apache spiritual practices with new religions. Children were taken to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their traditions. Poverty, hunger, and disease were constant companions. And yet, the Apache adapted as they had always done. Some learned new trades, raising livestock or farming as best they could under poor conditions. Others found work as scouts for the US Army, using their skills as warriors to earn a living, though this often placed them in the painful position of serving the very forces that had subdued them. The long walks, the forced surrenders, and the reservations were designed to end Apache independence, but they did not end Apache identity. The memory of the marches, the sorrow of exile, and the stories of leaders who resisted became part of a collective heritage, binding future generations to the struggles of the past. The very act of survival on reservations, of maintaining language and culture under oppressive conditions, was itself a continuation of resistance. Though the Apache could no longer roam freely across the Southwest, their spirit endured, transformed, but not erased. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Apache as a free people of the mountains and plains were gone, but the Apache as a cultural and historical community remained. The long walks were remembered not only as tragedies, but as tests of endurance, proof that even under the harshest conditions they could endure. The reservations, while symbols of confinement, also became places where identity could be preserved, however imperfectly. The surrenders mark the end of one era but also the beginning of another, where the struggle shifted from open war to the subtler battles of cultural survival. The story of this period is not only one of loss but also of resilience. The long walks broke bodies but not spirits. The surrenders ended independence but not dignity. The reservations imposed control but could not erase memory. In the face of overwhelming force, the Apache adapted as they always had, finding ways to endure, to pass on traditions, and to carry their identity forward. The era of free movement across the deserts and mountains had ended, but the story of the Apache was far from over. Their survival through these ordeals ensured that their legacy would continue into the 20th century and beyond, carried by the descendants who remembered both the suffering and the strength of their ancestors. When Geronimo and his small band surrendered in 1886, the US government treated them not as people who had been forced into peace after decades of conflict, but as captives to be held indefinitely. The distinction mattered greatly. Other tribes who surrendered were often placed on reservations in or near their homelands, where, however difficult the conditions, there remained some connection to the land of their ancestors. The Chiricahua Apache, however, were declared prisoners of war and removed entirely from the Southwest. This decision would shape their lives for generations, as hundreds of men, women and children were transported thousands of miles away to places they had never seen, to climates and environments utterly foreign to their traditions. Florida and later Oklahoma became their homes in name, but in truth they were prisons, and the years spent there left a legacy of both trauma and adaptation that defined their story in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The relocation began almost immediately after Geronimo's surrender. In September of 1886, nearly 500 Chiricahua, including warriors, families, and even those who had never fought against the United States, were loaded onto trains and shipped east. For many, it was their first time seeing railroads, and the journey itself was disorienting and frightening. They left behind the deserts, mountains, and open skies of Arizona and New Mexico, exchanging them for the humid swamps and dense forests of Florida. The trip took them to Fort Marion in St. Augustine and to Fort Pickens near Pensacola. Soldiers guarded them closely. for to the US government these people remained dangerous enemies even in captivity. The arrival in Florida was devastating. The Chiricahua had lived for centuries in arid, high-altitude environments where the air was dry and the land familiar. Florida was the opposite, humid, wet, filled with insects and diseases to which they had no resistance. Malaria, tuberculosis, and other illnesses spread quickly among them, claiming lives almost immediately. Children were especially vulnerable, and the loss of the young created grief that rippled through every family. Survivors remembered the sound of coughing echoing through the prison barracks, the fever that swept through camp after camp, and the sense of helplessness as people who had once thrived in the mountains wasted away in a climate that felt hostile to every breath. The prisons themselves were harsh. At Fort Marion, men were confined in the old Spanish-built Castillo de San Marcos, its thick stone walls turning into stifling ovens in the Florida heat. Women and children were housed separately, often in wooden barracks with poor ventilation. Food was meagre, rations unfamiliar, and the transition from a diet built on hunting, foraging and raiding to one of military-issued supplies left many weak. Soldiers controlled every aspect of daily life, and freedom of movement was non-existent. For people who had defined themselves by their ability to roam, to hunt, to raid, and to live according to their own choices, the confinement was unbearable. Yet even in these dire circumstances, the Apache adapted. Families worked to preserve their language, teaching children their words despite the constant pressure to learn English. Ceremonies were held quietly, away from the eyes of soldiers, to keep traditions alive. Leaders tried to maintain some sense of structure within the chaos, ensuring that their people did not lose the bonds of kinship that had sustained them through centuries of hardship. Even as disease and death claimed many, the survivors held on to identity as an act of defiance. They were prisoners, but they refused to be broken. By the late 1880s, the death toll in Florida had become undeniable. Reports of high mortality, especially among children, reached Washington, and public outcry began to mount. The government eventually decided to move the Chiricahua once again, this time to Alabama. At Mount Vernon Barracks near Mobile, conditions were somewhat better than in Florida, though they were still prisoners under constant guard. The climate, while still humid, was less deadly, and the population began to stabilize. Here too they adapted, creating small gardens, raising chickens and finding ways to survive within their confinement. Still, they remained far from home, cut off from the landscapes that gave meaning to their traditions, and every day carried the weight of exile. It was during these years that Geronimo himself became a public figure. Though a prisoner, he was paraded before journalists, photographers, and curious visitors. He sold autographs, posed for pictures, and later was taken to fairs and exhibitions as a living relic of a vanished frontier. To some Americans, he became a curiosity. To others, a symbol of the Wild West they believed was fading. For his own people, his visibility was both a source of pride and of pain. For while he was famous, they remained prisoners, unable to return to their lands or live freely. Geronimo's presence kept their story in the public eye, but it also reminded them of how much had been lost. The final relocation came in 1894, when the Chiricahua were moved again, this time to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. By then they had spent nearly a decade in captivity, and many had died. Those who survived the journey to Oklahoma faced yet another new environment, the rolling plains of the southern frontier, a landscape very different from both the mountains of Arizona and the swamps of Florida. At Fort Sill they remained under military control, officially classified as prisoners of war. The designation would not be lifted for nearly 30 years, making them the longest-held prisoners of war in United States history. Life at Fort Sill was a strange mixture of confinement and adaptation. The army allowed the Apache to build houses, farm small plots of land, and even send their children to schools. Some men joined the military as scouts, using their knowledge of terrain and tracking to serve the very institution that had defeated them. Women took on new roles as providers within the limited economy of the fort, making clothing, weaving baskets, and preserving traditions. Children were caught in between, many forced into boarding schools where they were punished for speaking Apache or practicing their customs. The pressure to assimilate was relentless, but families resisted in quiet ways, teaching their language and stories at home, keeping ceremonies alive when possible, and reminding their children that they were Apache despite what the government tried to make them believe. The years at Fort Sill brought profound changes. By the early 20th century, the Apache population had declined significantly due to disease, malnutrition, and the long toll of captivity. But those who survived began to carve out new identities. Some converted to Christianity, blending new beliefs with old traditions. Others became ranchers and farmers, adapting skills to the land around the fort. Geronimo himself became a paradoxical figure, riding in parades, attending the World's Fair in 1904, even meeting President Theodore Roosevelt, yet always returning to Fort Sill as a prisoner. He died there in 1909, still longing to return to Arizona, a wish that was never granted. The prisoner years in Florida and Oklahoma left a deep scar on Apache memory. They symbolize betrayal, the promises made at surrender that were never kept, the hope of peace that was twisted into captivity. They represented dislocation, the severing of ties to sacred landscapes, the burial of loved ones far from ancestral ground. Yet they also demonstrated resilience. Through decades of captivity, the Apache did not vanish. They endured, adapting as they always had, finding ways to survive in environments meant to break them. The very act of continuing to exist as Apache in Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma was a victory of spirit over circumstance. By 1913, the government finally released the surviving Chiricahua from prisoner of war status. Some chose to remain at Fort Sill, where they had built homes and communities over 2 decades. Others moved to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico, joining relatives and seeking to reconnect with lands closer to their ancestral home. The division reflected the complexity of their history. Some had forged new lives in Oklahoma, others longed to return west, but whether in Fort Sill or Mescalero, they carried with them the memory of the long exile, of Florida's fevers, Alabama's barracks, and Oklahoma's years of confinement. The legacy of life as prisoners of war was profound. It shaped Apache identity in the 20th century, instilling both trauma and pride. The trauma came from the losses, the deaths of children, the erosion of traditions, the pain of exile. The pride came from endurance, from the refusal to vanish, from the ability to remain Apache, despite every attempt to erase them. In this way, the prisoner years became part of the larger story of survival, a continuation of the resistance that had begun centuries earlier against the Spanish and carried on through Mexico and the United States. The Chiricahua Apache, once feared as warriors of the mountains and deserts, became symbols of survival in captivity. Their story, often overlooked in broader narratives of the West, is one of the most extraordinary examples of resilience in the face of overwhelming force. They were held as prisoners of war longer than any other group in US history, yet they emerged from that captivity still speaking their language, still practicing their traditions, still calling themselves Apache. Their endurance ensured that their descendants could carry on the legacy into the modern era, keeping alive the memory of what was lost and what was preserved. The turn of the 20th century found the Apache scattered, diminished in numbers, and weighed down by generations of war, forced relocation, and captivity. Yet what followed was not disappearance, but transformation. Having endured the long walks, the surrenders, and the years as prisoners of war, Apache communities entered a new century with a determination to preserve who they were, even as government policy, economic hardship, and assimilationist pressures bore down on them. The 20th century was not marked by open war but by quieter struggles, battles fought in classrooms, churches, government offices and family homes. These were struggles over language, culture, and identity, over whether the Apache would remain Apache in the face of relentless attempts to make them into something else. One of the most immediate challenges was language. For generations, Apache identity had been tied to the spoken word. Stories, songs, ceremonies, and traditions were passed down orally, carried by elders and preserved in memory rather than written records. The United States government, however, pursued policies designed to suppress indigenous languages. Apache children were sent to boarding schools, often far from their families, where they were punished for speaking their own words. English was enforced as the only acceptable language, and children who resisted were beaten, humiliated, or denied food. The purpose was clear: to erase Apache culture by erasing the means through which it was transmitted. Yet language survived. Despite the punishments, children whispered Apache words to one another in secret, learning songs and stories at home during holidays or in the evenings after school. Parents and grandparents continued to speak to them in their native tongue, even if it had to be done quietly. The resilience of Apache languages through these years of suppression reflected the deep commitment of families to keep alive the essence of who they were. While fluency declined under the weight of these pressures, the fact that the languages endured into the mid and late 20th century at all was a testament to resistance. Ceremonies also remained central to survival. The coming-of-age rituals for young women, known among the Western Apache as the Sunrise Ceremony, continued to be practiced even when missionaries and government officials sought to ban them. These ceremonies, often lasting several days, brought communities together, reaffirming spiritual traditions and teaching the values of endurance, generosity, and respect. To hold such ceremonies in the face of external hostility required courage, but it was done because families knew that without them, cultural continuity would be broken. Ceremonial life became a form of defiance, a way of asserting that the Apache were still present, still connected to the spiritual powers that had guided their ancestors. Religious identity became another arena of adaptation. Many Apaches were exposed to Christianity through missions, boarding schools, and churches established on reservations. Some converted, blending new practices with traditional beliefs. Yet even those who adopted Christianity often retained elements of Apache spirituality, creating hybrid forms of faith that carried both worlds together. In this way, religion became another example of Apache adaptability, not simple replacement but selective adoption, a way of navigating pressures without surrendering entirely. Some families became deeply Christian, while others clung tightly to older practices, but across communities the thread of spiritual continuity remained. Economically, the 20th century brought new challenges. Reservations were often located on marginal lands, with poor soil and limited resources. Poverty became widespread, with families dependent on government rations, later on welfare programs, and on whatever wages could be earned from seasonal labour. Some men found work as ranch hands, railroad labourers, or in military service. Others participated in rodeos, where Apache riders demonstrated horsemanship that drew crowds while also maintaining a cultural connection to the skills of earlier generations. Women adapted by selling crafts such as beadwork, baskets, and textiles, which not only provided income but also preserved artistic traditions. In this way, even economic survival became intertwined with cultural preservation. The wars of the 20th century also played a role in shaping identity. Apache men enlisted in the US military during both World War I and World War II, serving with distinction. For some, military service was a way to earn respect in a society that had long marginalized them. For others, it was a continuation of warrior traditions, a means of proving courage and protecting community, even if the battles were fought far from their homeland. Among the most famous were the Apache code talkers of World War II, who used their language as a weapon against Axis powers, transmitting messages that enemy forces could not decipher. In this ironic twist, The very language that had been suppressed in boarding schools became a tool of national defense, highlighting both its resilience and its value. Education was another contested space. The government-run schools sought to assimilate Apache children, but over time, Apache communities began to push back. By the mid-20th century, native activists and leaders called for more control over education, demanding schools that respected and taught indigenous culture rather than erasing it. This movement gained strength in the 1960s and 1970s as broader Native American activism challenged federal policies across the United States. For the Apache, this meant a gradual shift from schools that punished language and tradition to programs that encouraged their revival. Tribal colleges, language preservation programs, and cultural centers emerged, slowly reversing decades of suppression. The 20th century also brought legal and political struggles over land and sovereignty. Reservations established in the 19th century were often small remnants of vast ancestral territories, and disputes over boundaries, resources, and jurisdiction became constant. The Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico, for example, gained recognition as a center of Apache life, with its people fighting for control over forests, grazing lands, and later gaming enterprises. The Western Apache of San Carlos and White Mountain faced their own challenges, often dealing with federal agencies over water rights and land use. These struggles were not only about economics, but about identity, for land remained at the heart of Apache culture. To defend land was to defend tradition, memory, and future generations. Urbanization added another layer of complexity. Like many native peoples, some Apache families left reservations in the mid-20th century, encouraged by federal relocation programs that promised jobs and housing in cities. Los Angeles, Phoenix, and other urban centers became new homes for Apache individuals seeking opportunity. Yet relocation often led to isolation, as families were cut off from community ties and traditions. Even so, Apache identity endured in cities, with families gathering to share food, stories, and language, forming urban Indian centers that helped maintain connections. Throughout the century, the Apache demonstrated remarkable adaptability in holding on to their identity while engaging with the modern world. Rodeo champions, military veterans, artists, and leaders emerged from their communities, carrying forward both Apache traditions and new ways of living. The balance was never easy, as poverty, discrimination, and assimilationist pressures persisted. But survival was never in doubt. The very fact that Apache culture remained visible, audible, and practiced into the late 20th century was proof of resilience. By the closing decades of the century, cultural revival gained momentum. Elders recognized the danger of a language loss and worked to teach younger generations. Ceremonies were renewed with greater openness, sometimes even supported by tribal governments. Apache musicians, writers, and activists began to share their perspectives with broader audiences, ensuring that their culture was not only preserved but celebrated. The story of the 20th century was not one of disappearance, but of endurance and renewal, the quiet strength of families who refused to let their traditions be extinguished. The survival of Apache culture in the 20th century is a story of persistence in the face of erasure. It is the story of children whispering their language when forbidden, of families holding ceremonies under threat of punishment, of veterans carrying warrior traditions into new battlefields, of artists weaving old symbols into modern expressions. It is the story of communities that endured exile, poverty, and pressure, yet emerged into the new millennium still Apache, still speaking, still singing, still teaching. In this way, the 20th century was not merely a time of survival, but of laying the groundwork for a future in which Apache identity could flourish openly once again. The story of the Apache does not end with the wars, the surrenders, or even the long years of captivity in Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma. Their history did not freeze in the 19th century, nor did their culture vanish in the 20th. The Apache legacy is alive today, carried by descendants who live in New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, and beyond. who remember the struggles of their ancestors and continue to shape their identity in a modern world. It is a legacy made of memory, born from centuries of resistance and survival, but also of ongoing struggle, for the challenges of poverty, sovereignty, and cultural preservation remain. At the same time, it is a legacy of renewal, with communities working to revive language, ceremonies, and traditions that once seemed at risk of being lost. The Apache today are not relics of the past, but living nations, constantly redefining themselves while holding fast to the core of who they are. Memory is at the heart of this legacy. For generations, Apache families have carried stories of the past, passing them from elders to children. These stories are not only about famous leaders like Geronimo, Cochise, or Mangas Coloradas, but also about the everyday endurance of families who survived relocations, boarding schools, and life on reservations. Oral tradition remains a central pillar of identity. Grandparents tell stories of the long walks, of San Carlos, of Fort Sill, and of the hardships their people faced. These memories ensure that the past is not forgotten, that the pain of betrayal and the resilience of survival remain part of the community's collective consciousness. To forget would be to lose connection to the ancestors, so memory is preserved not just as history but as identity itself. Commemoration has also become an important part of the legacy. Sites of significance, such as Apache Pass in Arizona, the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, and Fort Sill in Oklahoma, hold deep meaning for descendants. Ceremonies, pilgrimages, and gatherings at these places reconnect people with their history, transforming landscapes into living reminders of endurance. Museums, historical societies, and tribal organizations now work to preserve artifacts, documents, and oral histories, ensuring that future generations can access the story of their ancestors not only through government records, but through Apache voices. Memory, then, is not static. It is active, constantly renewed by storytelling, commemoration, and teaching. Struggle, however, remains part of the Apache reality. Reservations established in the 19th century continue to exist, but they are often marked by poverty, unemployment, and limited resources. The San Carlos Apache Reservation, sometimes called Hell's 40 Acres by earlier generations, still grapples with economic hardship, though it is also a center of cultural vitality. The Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico has developed industries such as skiing and gaming, yet it too faces challenges of poverty and social problems. In Oklahoma, descendants of the Chiricahua, who were once prisoners of war, continue to wrestle with questions of identity, divided between those who remained at Fort Sill and those who relocated to Mescalero. These struggles are not only about economics, but about sovereignty, the right of Apache nations to govern themselves, to control their lands, and to make decisions about their future without interference. Legal battles have played a large role in this continuing struggle. Issues of water rights, land use, and sacred sites have repeatedly brought Apache communities into conflict with state and federal authorities. The fight to protect Oak Flat, a sacred site in Arizona threatened by copper mining, stands as one of the most prominent examples. For the San Carlos Apache, Oak Flat is not simply land, but a place of ceremony, of spiritual connection, of identity. The proposed mine represents not just environmental destruction, but cultural erasure. Apache activists have taken their cause to courts, to Congress, and to the international stage, continuing the centuries-long fight to defend their lands against outsiders. These modern struggles echo the past, demonstrating that while the weapons and battlefields have changed, the core issue, the defense of Apache sovereignty, remains. Language preservation is another front in the modern struggle. By the late 20th century, decades of suppression in boarding schools and the pressures of assimilation had left Apache languages endangered. Fluency declined as younger generations grew up speaking mostly English, and elders realized that their words might vanish within a few decades if action was not taken. In response, language revitalization programs emerged. schools on reservations began teaching Apache alongside English. Tribal governments invested in language materials, dictionaries, and recordings of elders. Technology became a tool of renewal, with language apps, online courses, and social media used to spread Apache words to younger generations. While challenges remain, the effort reflects a powerful commitment to ensure that the voices of the ancestors are not silenced, that Apache children can still speak the words that connect them to their history. Ceremonial life, too, has seen revival. Coming-of-age ceremonies, healing rituals, and seasonal celebrations are practiced openly, no longer forced into hiding as they were during the boarding school era. The sunrise ceremony, in particular, has regained prominence, with communities gathering to celebrate the transition of young women into adulthood. These ceremonies reaffirm cultural values, bind communities together, and connect participants to the spiritual forces that have guided the Apache for centuries. The revival of ceremony is not simply tradition for its own sake. It is renewal, a declaration that Apache culture is alive and will continue into the future. Art, music, and storytelling have also become vehicles of renewal. Apache artists blend traditional symbols with contemporary forms, creating paintings, beadwork, and sculptures that speak to both past and present. Musicians incorporate Apache language and themes into modern genres, ensuring that culture resonates with younger audiences. Writers and filmmakers tell Apache stories from Apache perspectives, challenging stereotypes and reclaiming narratives once controlled by outsiders. In each of these expressions, the legacy of resilience is carried forward, adapted to new times but always rooted in the same identity. Education has become both a challenge and a tool of empowerment. After generations of being subjected to schools designed to erase them, Apache communities now fight for control of their children's education. Tribal schools emphasize culture, history, and language alongside mainstream subjects, ensuring that students grow up with pride in who they are. Higher education, too, has become a path for many Apache youth, who attend colleges and universities while maintaining ties to their communities. Leaders emphasize the importance of education not as assimilation, but as a means of empowerment, a way to navigate the modern world without losing identity. In the political sphere, Apache leaders continue to assert sovereignty and self-determination. Tribal councils govern reservations, making decisions about land use, economic development, and cultural preservation. Federal recognition grants certain rights, but Apache nations constantly work to expand their authority and resist encroachments. The struggle for sovereignty in the 21st century may involve courtrooms rather than battlefields, but the spirit is the same, a refusal to surrender control of their destiny to outsiders. The legacy today is also carried in the faces of the young, Apache youth, growing up with smartphones, internet, and global culture, face the challenge of balancing modern life with the traditions of their ancestors. They hear the stories of Geronimo, Cochise, and Mangus Coloraders, and they are reminded that they descend from people who resisted the greatest empires of their time. They also hear the stories of San Carlos, of Fort Sill, of Florida, and they learn that survival was not just about battles won, but about endurance through suffering. Their task is to carry this legacy forward, to find ways of being Apache in a modern world while staying true to the essence of their culture. The Apache legacy today is therefore threefold: memory, struggle, and renewal. Memory ensures that the past is not forgotten, that the pain and resilience of ancestors remain alive in stories, ceremonies, and places. Struggle continues as battles over land, language, and sovereignty remain as pressing as ever, and renewal flourishes as language programs, ceremonies, and cultural expressions breathe new life into traditions once suppressed. Together, these elements show that the Apache are not a people of the past, but of the present and future, carrying forward a story that began centuries ago and continues to unfold. To speak of the Apache today is to speak of a people who have endured every attempt to erase them, from Spanish conquest to Mexican scalp bounties to American military campaigns and boarding schools. It is to speak of communities who remain rooted in their lands, even when scattered, who continue to fight for their rights and who celebrate their traditions openly. It is to recognize that the Apache are not merely remembered in history books, but are living nations shaping their own futures. The legacy of the Apache today is one of survival, but more than survival, it is a legacy of persistence, strength, and renewal that ensures they will remain a vital part of the American story for generations to come.